The Defiant, Star Legend Book 6, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Chapter 1. Spiral City, Java glowed in the morning sun. Once it had been a sea of shacks. Entire families had lived in single-room houses made from corrugated iron, sharing a single stinking pit toilet with hundreds of others. Water had come from a standpipe, and it often made you sick. Danger stalked the slum dwellers, stray dogs that transmitted a terrible fatal disease through their bites, fires that spread faster than anyone could run, bad men in shadows waiting to snatch an unwary child. Seti Aziz gazed out across the cityscape from a steep street in the poor hilly quarter, ruminating on how everything looked different now. After the Britannic Alliance starship had sent back revelatory scientific information from deep space, things had begun to change. Setia didn't understand much about it, but apparently the knowledge had allowed scientists and engineers to develop new technologies for transportation, farming, medicine, building, so many things. And the spirals had begun to appear in her hometown. She recalled the first gravity-defying building going up in the city centre. Everyone had marvelled as each thick, tall story appeared, sweeping around a wide curve, hanging impossibly in the air, supported only by the central base. When the building was complete at 15 stories high, a machine had applied a brilliant orange reflective coating, turning the entire structure into a beacon, a burning flame in the dull grey scene emblazoned with the name of the multinational corporation owners. The name stuck in minds near and far, as was exactly the intention. As she grew from a child to an adolescent, the trend for spiral structures had caught on. Shining edifices in a myriad of colours had sprung up everywhere. The form appealed to her countrymen, Setia guessed. She had little access to news from other countries, but she hadn't seen pictures or reports about similar buildings, and so Spiral City had earned its unofficial name. She was proud of the place. It was home, all she'd ever known, and it would break her heart to leave it. But she had no choice if she wanted to live. "Setia!" The urgent whisper had come from somewhere to her right. She spied a childhood friend in the darkness between two shacks. "Aulia, what are you doing? Why are you hiding?" "Don't look at me. Pratam has sent someone after you. He knows you're here." Aulia was gone. Her dear old friend had risked her life to protect her. If word ever got back to Pratam about the warning, Aulia's life would also be forfeit. Setia was already running. She went downhill, hoping she wasn't heading toward her attacker. She pushed past the barefoot pedestrians blocking her way. Seniors, children, and the unemployed were out on errands or shopping. The street was thick with them. Roadside vendors created more obstacles, though they would be obstacles for her pursuers too. Who was coming after her? Aulia hadn't said. Would it be muscle-bound Sole, Pratam's right hand and brute enforcer of his will? Or perhaps it would be Yuda, the silent assassin, murderer of the powerful, the elite whose deaths must be quiet and of undefined causes. She risked a glance over her shoulder. It was Sole. She hadn't seen the man, only the effects of his progress. At the top of the street in the dusty haze, the crowd was violently parting. A channel had formed, its edges made of crushed, stumbling passers-by. Shouts of protest and alarm leaked through the hubbub. Setia stepped up her pace. As she vaulted a low table, her toe knocked a street magician's cards from his hands. A vulgar curse followed her, something involving the insertion of body parts into ill-considered orifices. A woman laden with pastries crossed her path. She had no time to dodge. She smashed into her, scattering her wares across the ground. A hungry mob descended and a scuffle ensued. She felt bad for the woman, but the accident should slow Sole down. She'd reached the bottom of the hill, where the market petered out into a handful of stalls and the crowd thinned. An alley opened to her left. Sidestepping a beggar sitting cross-legged, his upturned palms level with the dirty rag bound over his eyes, she darted down the alley. It ran alongside a derelict building, once a vast department store. On the other side stood a building site fence. A green metal constructor suddenly reared beyond it. The machine's rounded head bobbed up and down as its long, articulated arm laid blocks at a breathtaking speed. If she jumped the fence, she would be safe from Sole, but in danger from the constructor bots. Humans weren't allowed on building sites. The manufacturers couldn't guarantee the constructors would stop in time before hurting someone. But maybe she was already safe. She looked back over her shoulder, panting. No, Sole was kicking the beggar aside. He must have seen her turn off the main street. As their gazes met across the distance, he looked furious. Glistening with sweat, his shirt wide open, his expression black as a thundercloud, he was probably incensed that she hadn't given herself up and allowed him to kill her without going to all this bother. She ran. The alley was long. Both the old department store and the construction site were vast. When would she reach the end? She flicked another glance over her shoulder. Burnap's balls! Solo was gaining on her. She scanned the department store wall. Bricks, some more bricks. Not a door, a window, or even a vent at ground level. Not a single opening in the blank expanse. Then the end of the alley grew clear. Yes! No! What she'd thought had been the wall of a street or another alley running across this one was in fact a dead end. The light dimmed as if illustrating her dismal predicament, but she had no time to figure out why. Normal brightness quickly returned. Her only escape was the fence. She would have to take her chance with the constructor whirring and clanking to her right, and she had to do it now before Sole reached her. Setia Z's. A tall, slim figure had appeared from nowhere. She skidded to a halt. Burnap's balls! Where did you come from? She was sure he hadn't been here a second ago. There was no door he could have stepped from, and she assumed he couldn't walk through walls. Before the man could answer, she said, "Forget it!" She leapt for the top of the fence. "Nice to meet you, and good—" The strange man tugged sharply on her ankle. She tumbled down, grazing her knees on the rough ground. What the hell? Sole had reached her. His hands on his muscled hips, his gaze moved from Setia to the interloper. He had to be trying to figure out if the man was friend or foe. So was Setia. Judging from the fact he'd prevented her from escaping, he was not a friend, but any port in a storm. "Thanks for coming to my rescue," she said confidently, edging behind him. "Sole, as you can see, I'm not alone. I have important and—" She squinted up into the man's enigmatic face. "Powerful allies, more important and powerful than Pratam, so you can go back and tell him he'd better forget about me if he knows what's good for him." "Pratam doesn't give a shit about your friend," Sole spat. However, he also didn't move a single step forward. "Someone has to pay for the missing merch, and that someone is you." This is what pissed Setia off so much about the whole affair. None of it was her fault. She had run drugs for her boss faithfully and reliably for over 2 years, never missing an appointment, never getting smart-mouthed with the customers, no matter how much they deserved it, never skimming a little off the top and substituting with detergent as many runners did. Was it her fault she'd been robbed? It had to happen sooner or later. It was one of the inevitable drawbacks of the business. By punishing her, he was hurting himself. Reliable runners were hard to come by, but Pratam was as stupid as he was vindictive. "Fight," said the stranger. "What?" She double-checked he was speaking to her, not Sole. This wasn't how she'd hoped things would go. It would have been better if he told Sole to go away. Infinitely better if he produced a gun and shot him. The man's dark eyes bored into hers. Dressed in a dark grey suit, his clothes marked him out as one of Spiral City's wealthier citizens. Yet there was something not quite right about him. He grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into her flesh like steel pins, and dragged her forward until she stood between him and Sole. Fight? Setia's opponent grinned and rubbed the knuckles of one hand into the palm of the other. "No weapons," said the man in a commanding tone. Sole had been obeying orders all his life, and he was even dumber than Pratam. He nodded agreement, pulled knives from their sheaths on each side of his torso, bent down and slid them along the ground a couple of meters to his rear. Setia still had no hope of beating him. Sole stood head and shoulders taller than her, and he was about twice as wide. He was also a killer and a practiced brawler, while she had only been in the usual street fights, mostly bravado and windmilling fists. She had learned enough to extract herself and run away, which had always seemed to her the wisest response. The strange man's hand remained on her shoulder. She'd almost forgotten about it in all the excitement, but then an odd feeling emanated from his touch. A sensation flowed from it, a hot, liquid feeling like blood pouring from a wound, but instead it was flowing into her. An energized thrill passed through her, leaving every part feeling stronger. Her muscles no longer ached from running, her panting ceased, and her heart rate slowed and steadied. Calmness and confidence suffused her. Her mouth dropped open, and she stared at the man. Was this some new type of drug? She'd never tried any of Pratam's merchandise. The terrible state of his customers had put her off the stuff for life, but her experience seemed similar to accounts she'd heard. Still, what good would drugs do against? As she'd been staring at the stranger slack-jawed, she glimpsed movement in her peripheral vision. The next thing she knew, her forearm hit something meaty. Sole had swung for her, and she'd blocked him without even thinking about it. Sole looked as surprised as she felt. He threw another fist. Like an automaton, she ducked. As his momentum carried him forward, she grabbed his shirt and pulled him closer and down before driving her knee into his nose. He toppled forward and she kicked his knee, buckling it. He screamed and collapsed. She leapt on top of him and locked her leg around his neck, folding her other leg over the first, pulling it tight. Sole tried to rise, but her weight held him down. He tried to prise her from his throat, but she squeezed tighter. In a few seconds, his body went limp. Setia lay still, numbly wondering what had just happened. How had she managed to defeat Sole, Pratam's best fighter? It had all taken place so quickly. She'd moved as if by instinct. The man was holding out a hand. She grasped it, and he helped her to her feet. "Come with me, Setia. I have someone I would like you to meet. You are both destined for great things." Chapter 2. Patron Ellis clenched and unclenched his hands as they rested on his knees. He took in a deep breath and then exhaled slowly and evenly, practicing the technique Mam had taught him to ease his racing pulse. It didn't do much good. Sweat prickled his brow and trickled down the back of his neck. The room was too warm. Why did they have to make it so warm? It was barely autumn outside, let alone winter. There was no need for them to have the heating on. Caris leaned in close and murmured, "You'll do fine, don't worry." "I'm not worried," he shot back heatedly. Then, feeling shameful at his outburst, he repeated, more gently, "I'm not really worried. I just wish they would get it over with. Why are they taking so long?" She shrugged. "These things take a long time. They have to do everything correctly, according to the rules. If they make a mistake, it gives his team an opening. You don't want to go through this again, do you?" Definitely not. Then try to be patient. Answer every question clearly, to the best of your knowledge and memory. You can't do any better than that. It'll be over before you know it. I wish. He recognized some of the people in the waiting room, or at least he thought he recognized them. 10 years had passed since he'd seen these boys and girls, and they were not allowed to speak to each other, to exchange names or stories. The evidence had to be as uncorrupted as possible, uninfluenced by other accounts of what had happened. He and Caris were an exception. They'd lived together since returning to West BI. Any sharing of stories had already taken place, the authorities said, so it didn't matter if they talked to each other, except they hadn't shared anything. Neither he nor Caris ever mentioned that time. He supposed she didn't want to bring up the subject any more than he did. Why go over something that made your guts clamp down in painful knots whenever you thought about it? There was nothing either of them could say that would change the past. Kayla was lucky. She had been so young then, she'd been ruled out as a reliable witness. The door slid open in a quiet whoosh, loud in the silent room. "Patron Ellis," said the official, reading from an interface. "Good luck," Caris whispered as he stood up. He didn't look back at her as he left. The official led him along a narrow passageway and up some steps. At the top of the steps stood an open door, light spilling from it. The low hum of quiet voices also leaked out. He stepped through the opening and the voices quietened to silence. The door snicked closed behind him. The official had disappeared. He was alone inside a booth with transparent plastic walls. The judge sat highest in the room on a platform behind a polished desk. Men and women in suits were behind more desks. He recognized one of them, Mr. Barnaby, who had helped him prepare for today. Beyond the lawyers was the audience, perched on rows of benches squashed together. The place was packed. His gaze roved the faces. Where was she? Then he saw her. Ma'am. She smiled and gave a little wave. His nervousness fell away. Sitting next to her was her boyfriend, TJ. Ma'am always called him by his surname, Wright. He wasn't sure why. He liked TJ. He was a good guy. Good for Ma'am. Steady and kind. She needed someone like that. "Just be honest about what you remember," she'd said. "That's all. Just tell them what happened." "Would the witness please be seated?" the judge snapped. Shit. He slid into the seat, embarrassed. Everyone was staring at him. They must think he's an idiot. He went through the formalities, swearing to tell the truth. There were no mics he could see. He guessed the see-through walls would pick up his response as he gave his replies. Mr. Barnaby was suddenly in front of the booth. Patron braced himself for the questions to come. Then he saw the accused. Sitting at the defense barrier's desks was a man whose face made him instantly fearful. The man looked much older, thinner, and paler than Patron remembered, and his thick dark hair had been replaced by strands of silvery grey. It was no wonder he hadn't recognized him at first, but now he looked closely, he was in no doubt it was Summoner Sieber. Like so many Crusaders, Sieber had vanished into the ether after the Alliance had retaken the Isles, turning the tide of the war, pushing back the cultists' darkness and sparking the return to modern civilization and rationality. The last time Patron had seen him, Sieber had been coordinating the breakup of the camp in the Australian desert. In the light from flickering lamps, the children's captors had been moving to and fro, hastily collapsing the tents and gathering supplies, loading them onto horse-drawn wagons, ready to flee into the desert. So much had happened that night and over the following days. Patron preferred not to recall the memories, but Barnaby's questions mostly focused on earlier times. He answered as well as he could, He had to talk about specific instances he'd seen Sieber giving orders and punishing children through beating or starvation. After each answer, Barnaby would very briefly pause and glance at the jury. The court was an old-fashioned way of running Sieber's trial. Modern trials didn't take place in courtrooms with everyone physically present anymore. No one had to leave their home or office to give their testimony. But the Crusader war crimes trials were held differently as a concession to their culture and beliefs. He would have preferred to be at home and not on show to hundreds of people. "No further questions, Your Honour," said Barnaby. Patron relaxed and then tensed. Now it was the other side's turn. These questions would be harder. Barnaby had said Sieber's team would try to confuse and trick him to make him look stupid or a liar. Just tell them what happened. "Patron," said the woman who had approached the booth as Barnaby returned to his seat. "May I call you that?" Patron looked at the judge. "Address the witness as Mr. Ellis." "I apologise, Your Honour. I was only trying to put the boy at ease. Mr. Ellis, how old were you when you were at the Crusader camp?" "About 7 or 8. "About 7 or 8? You can't remember?" This was what Barnaby had warned him about. "The seasons in Australia are the opposite of what they are here in the BI," Patron explained, "and the Crusaders never told us the date or even the month. But I remember I had my 6th birthday at home with my mam and sister before the invasion. Then while I was on the Crusader ship, I began to lose track of time. After Mam found us and brought us home, I had my 9th birthday, so I must have been 7 and 8 when the Crusaders had me." The woman pulled a sour face. Behind her, Barnaby nodded and gave him a surreptitious thumbs up. The next questions the defence barrier asked went over the same incidents Barnaby had brought up. As predicted, she tried to trip him up over the details and kept her tone sceptical. He stuck like glue to what he'd already said. It was hard. He hated thinking about those things. He hated remembering the kids who had disappeared overnight and the cries of the ones who had been beaten. The worst images in his mind were from the night he'd escaped with Kayla, when they'd watched the barns burn in the darkness. Later on, he'd learned about the kids trapped inside them. He usually tried to blank out the memories, but the pain of going over it all again would be worth it if Sieber finally paid for everything he'd done. The old man had been found at Southern Cape, he'd heard, farming sugarcane. The locals had been suspicious about him for years. He'd continued to grow crops on the land after everyone else had taken up the new technology of using underground vats. He'd also treated his workers badly. One day, police had to intervene in a vicious altercation and his picture appeared in the media. A former captive at the Australian camp had recognised him and his past had caught up to him at last. "Mr. Ellis," said the barrister, "you've made serious allegations about the person you knew as Summoner Sieber, but by your own admission, you were only a young child when these events took place. Memories can be deceptive. Can you say with absolute certainty that my client is the same man who committed these acts? Isn't it possible it was someone else entirely who only bears a passing resemblance to him? Isn't that the case?" "Your Honour," said Barnaby, "how many questions is Mr. Ellis expected to answer?" "Sustained," said the judge. "Stop badgering the witness, counsel." "I apologise, Your Honour. Mr. Ellis, how do you know for sure my client is the Summoner Sieber you recall?" "Well, he has changed a lot. He used to be fatter and had a full head of hair." The woman began to smile. "But those jug-handle ears are unforgettable." The roar of laughter that erupted from the audience took minutes for the judge to quieten down. In the end, he had to threaten to dismiss the public from the courtroom. Mam was wiping her eyes and TJ had his hand over his mouth as his shoulders shook. In the general disturbance, Patron seemed to be the only person who noticed a man rise from his seat at the back. In a flash, he ran down the aisle to the wooden barrier separating the audience from the front of the room and leapt the gate in a single bound. A guard snatched at him but missed. Someone screamed. The man reached the defence team's desk and lifted his hand. Sieber's barrister leapt out of his way, overturning her chair. Something shiny and sharp grew out of the man's hand, extending from his fist. It was a knife. The guard shouted at him to drop it, but the blade swept down into Sieber's neck. He did nothing to defend himself. In fact, in the few seconds of action, Sieber seemed to offer up his throat. As the knife plunged again, the guard threw himself on the stranger and wrestled him away. The blade clattered to the floor, and the guard got the man down and knelt on his back. More guards arrived, but they were too late. The damage was done. Sieber sprawled face downward in a rapidly widening pool of blood. Chapter 3.
I think this is what he must have used,
Wright said, sliding an interface across the dining table. Talon peered at the article as she took a bite of toast. It was about a new material called flow metal. The substance wasn't actually metal, the article explained. It only looked metallic and had several properties in common. Most importantly, it was programmable. She lifted her eyes and read further. Flow metal could alter its shape according to digital input. As long as the total volume remained the same, it could be whatever you wanted, even things with simple working parts.
The attacker must have brought some into the courtroom, said Wright. The security scanners wouldn't have detected it because it isn't metal. Maybe he made it take another form so it looked like something else.
Right. And if he had one of the new neural transmitters...
Exactly.
She gave a shudder, recalling the knife appearing from nothing in the man's hand and its descent into Sieber's bared neck, smooth as a diver plunging into water. The blade must have been razor sharp. She'd had a front row seat for the murder. It had been years since she'd seen death close up, and she'd grown blessedly unused to it. Wright took the interface back.
Damned crusaders. All technology is evil until it isn't. Bloody hypocrites.
He swiped the screen to read something else and continued to eat his bacon and eggs, shoveling the food in as if it was going out of fashion. She smiled. Bacon and eggs must be a rare treat for a Royal Marine. You know you can get neural interfaces as well as transmitters now, she asked. No need for clunky handheld ones anymore. You could read and eat more easily. He gave a snort of disdain.
No thanks, this interferes in my life enough.
He tapped behind his ear on the spot where a military comm sat beneath his skull. She knew how he felt. She'd been relieved to have her comm removed, and she agreed with his distaste for neural interfaces. She wasn't anti-tech, but watching people interacting with something entirely invisible was creepy. She watched him eat. Though it had been a couple of months since he'd returned from his mission, sometimes it was still hard to believe he was back. Not only had he survived the incredibly dangerous journey into deep space, he was also here with her. They were together, and he seemed happy about it too. He glanced up and caught her staring.
What?
She smiled wider and reached out to cover his hand with her own. He grinned back, stood up, and leaned over the table to give her a bacon-flavour peck on the lips.
Are you ready? We have to leave soon.
She deflated. She'd been lost in the moment, forgetting today's appointment.
Cheer up, it'll be fun.
Fun? She asked incredulously, then sighed. I don't know if the kids are even awake yet. Have you seen them?
No, I haven't, come to think of it. Could you check? Colburn will be pissed off if we're late.
You say that as if I care. Heavy footsteps descended the stairs. "That's Patron," Taylan said. Her son entered, a knuckle rubbing one eye, his hair a tousled mess. He looked as though he'd barely slept. "Bad night?" she asked. Giving an adolescent grunt, Patron scanned the empty plates on the table, then asked, "Is there any breakfast left?" "There's plenty to eat in the kitchen, same as always." He shuffled past her. "Don't take too long," she said to his retreating back. "We leave for the Institute for Skein Studies soon, remember?" He didn't reply. Plates and cutlery clinked and clattered. "Are you sure we have to take Patron and Kayla?" Taylan asked Wright. "I don't know if it's a good idea, especially not after yesterday."
"They don't have to go. They're both minors. Technically, you can make the decision for them. But the Institute is expecting them, and don't you think they should know what they could be getting into?"
"I suppose you're right." Her doubts remained. The years that had passed since she'd returned to West BI had been peaceful and, for the most part, happy. She'd missed Wright horribly, and she'd feared for his life, but getting her kids back had meant the world to her. Bringing them up had been the cherry on the cake. If it hadn't been for the absence of this gentle, intelligent, courageous man, everything would have been perfect. Now he was back. She wanted things to stay this way. She wanted Wright to resign, to stay with her, and for them to grow old together in the usual boring, conventional manner. The Alliance's proposal made all of that impossible. As well, it put her children's lives at risk. It was a big ask. Refusing would be perfectly reasonable. Yet on the other hand, could she, in good conscience, say no? "Ma'am," Kayla called down the stairs, "I can't find my jeans." Taylan rolled her eyes and walked into the hall. Leaning on the banister rail, she shouted back, "Why is that my problem? Wear something else." "I don't have anything else." Pushing aside the mental image of Kayla's clothes-strewn room, Taylan replied, "I'm sure you can find something. Hurry up. You need to eat before we leave." Kayla's surprised face appeared at the top of the stairs. "Where are we going?" "You know. We talked about it last night, remember?" "Oh yeah, cool." She disappeared. 20 minutes later, the military car had arrived and they were on their way. Kayla began telling a long, involved story about a falling out among her school friends, while Patron stared out the car window in silence. He hadn't spoken much since yesterday, and he hadn't mentioned a word about what had happened at the trial. Talon worried about him. He was reacting exactly the same as he had to his period of captivity with the Crusaders, burying the trauma deep. She'd arranged numerous counseling and therapy sessions over the years to no end. He simply refused to open up about his experiences or admit to any after effects. His trial testimony had been new information. "Hey," said Kayla, as if an idea had suddenly occurred to her. "Where's Karis? Isn't she coming?" "I invited her," Talon replied, "but she wasn't interested. She's at the bird center." Karis had been volunteering at the Center for the Rescue and Rehabilitation of Birds of Prey for a couple of years. She loved it. It hadn't escaped Talon's notice that her adopted daughter had gone from saving Patron and Kayla's lives to rescuing wild animals. "Isn't she involved in this?" Kayla asked. "Apparently not. I told you about the mission proposal last night, remember?" "Yeah, I remember now. Anyway, Jemima is so annoyed." Talon faded out her daughter's prattle and rested her head on Wright's shoulder. In recognition of his exceptional service, he'd been on leave since the return of the Dauntless. Now, after long weeks of wearing civvies, he was back in uniform, and the sight, feel, and smell of the clothes made her sad and fearful.
"Do you want to go for a walk later?" he asked quietly. "Just us."
"I'd love to. Where do you want to go?" He suggested a cliff-top path an hour's drive from her home. It seemed an odd destination for an evening stroll, but she agreed. Chapter 4. The Institute for Skein Studies was an imposing building. Its black marble facade rose 6 or so stories high. The lack of windows made it hard to be exact, and the frontage occupied the entire street. The car dropped them at the main entrance, but their instructions stated they were to go to the mapping department door a little further down. The single door was less imposing, and the tiny sign next to it made it almost anonymous. "Right on time," said a middle-aged woman with a long brown ponytail who answered the buzzer. "I'm Dr. Prentice. Can I check your IDs?" she added apologetically. "It's just a formality." Talon waited for her to produce a scanner, but she only gazed at them expectantly. "I only need to look," Prentice explained. She had a neural interface. Talon lifted her wrist to the scientist's eyes, and Wright and the kids did the same. Prentice focused on each of their embedded chips in turn. "Excellent. Nice to meet you all. Lieutenant Colonel Wright, Brigadier Colburn has asked me to escort you to a separate conference room when the viewing is over."
"Okay, thanks."
"Lieutenant Colonel?" Talon asked as they went inside.
"I was promoted."
"You didn't say anything." He shrugged. Prentice led them to an elevator. They stepped in and it began to descend. "We're going down?" asked Kayla. Prentice replied, "There's less interference from living organisms underground." "What do you mean, less interference?" "It's complicated. You'll understand better when we show you." Kayla pulled a face, indicating she predicted utter boredom coming her way. Talon gave a mental sigh and leaned on the elevator wall as they descended. She watched her adolescent daughter surreptitiously as the ride continued. The Institute for Skein Studies was far more expansive below the surface, and it looked like they were heading for the lowest floor, B20. Kayla's growth spurt showed no signs of slowing down. She had always been a tall child, and now it seemed she would end up taller than her mother and perhaps nearly as tall as her towering brother. Her period of deprivation at the hands of the Crusaders didn't appear to have affected her physically, and mentally she appeared unscathed too. Thank the stars. If only the same could be said for Patron. The elevator slowed and stopped, and the doors opened. Prentice had indeed brought them to B20, the end of the line. It was a vast space, hundreds of meters long and wide. The room had to extend far beneath the surrounding streets. Pillars stood at regular intervals, providing support and marking the edges of sections where workers attended banks of machinery. An electric hum and faint scent of hot plastic filled the air.
"TJ!"
a voice boomed.
"Talon!"
Arthur strode toward them, and Talon drew in a breath. The ancient king looked as strong and vital as ever, but his red-gold hair and beard had turned entirely silver-grey. However, the locks remained thick and lustrous, cascading over his shoulders and chest. He grabbed Wright into a bear hug and landed audible thumps on his back. Then he turned to Talon. Before she could get away, he grabbed her too, in a suffocating hold, and lifted her off her feet. "It's good to see you too," she squeaked. He let go, dropping her. She could breathe again.
"It's been too long,"
Arthur said. He turned to regard Patron and Kayla.
"And it's wonderful to see these two as well. These are the little boy and girl I saw in Australia."
Shaking his head, he added,
"People have explained how much time passed on Earth while I was away, but I still find it hard to believe. Yet look at your children. Patron is a man, and Kayla is nearly old enough to be married."
"Not quite," Talon commented, alarmed. "Nowhere near old enough. And, strictly speaking, Patron isn't a man yet either. He's still legally a child." Arthur looked Patron up and down and frowned skeptically. However, he was clearly becoming used to the oddities of this new age he found himself in, for he didn't push back on Talon's words. Instead, he said to the boy,
"Your mother told me once you love horses. Do you know how to ride?
No, I don't, Patron replied.
Between school and Mam's training, I haven't had time to learn. Would you like me to teach you?
Are you kidding? I'd love it. Ma'am, you think I'm going to make you miss out on horse riding lessons from the King of the Britannic Isles? Patron breathed a silent yes.
Excellent,
said Arthur.
I believe we still have quite a while before we leave.
He asked Talon and Wright,
How do you feel about our new quest?
Quest? Kayla interjected. What's a quest?
A noble adventure, young maid.
Cool, a noble adventure. I like the sound of that. Arthur smiled.
You have your mother's brave heart, though I hope you don't have her tongue too, for all our sakes.
What? Why? Never mind, said Talon. Prentice said tentatively, now you're all reacquainted, would you mind stepping this way? As they followed her, she continued over her shoulder, I've been told the purpose of your visit is so I can fill you in on Skein mapping. I'm not sure how much you already know.
Personally, Wright replied, I know very little. Arthur and I missed out on all the developments of the last few years.
Okay, I'll start from the basics. Heads were turning and gazes following them as they walked along the open central aisle. No doubt everyone recognized Arthur. His face had been plastered over the news media ever since the Dauntless had returned, but the articles Talon had seen displayed an old photo of him. Perhaps the Alliance wanted to maintain a more youthful image of the king. The Skein mappers weren't only interested in Arthur as a public figure, they also had to be as stunned as she was by his transformation. This is as good a spot as any, said Prentice, stopping at a quadrangle of machines. 4 technicians sat in the middle facing a machine each. Right, if I could have your attention? Kayla was gazing slack-jawed at the seemingly endless rows of machinery. She returned her attention to the scientist. Put simply, connections exist between every living and non-living thing in the universe. We can't see them, and for a very long time we had only the smallest inkling they existed. How should I put it? She glanced upward, brow furrowed, before continuing. Physicists and mathematicians had spotted the signs. Particles that appeared to wink in and out of existence, for instance. Imaginary numbers, interactions between independent objects separated by huge distances. We understood some aspects of these things, but when we received the files from the Dauntless, we realized all these phenomena were like mountain tops poking up out of the ocean, indicating something hidden beneath the waves. With the help of a friendly extraterrestrial species, we've been allowed a peek in the water. Did she know Wright was the person the friendly extraterrestrial species had approached with the new knowledge? Clearly not, and he was the last person to blow his own trumpet. And what a vision it is, Prentice went on. What a mountain range within the ocean. Even now, years later, we haven't uncovered or applied 5% of the knowledge revealed. Yet one thing we do know with a great degree of certainty is there is a general background of connections of all matter. The main skein, as we like to call it. Now, you might think this would be homogeneous and evenly spread out, but nothing could be further from the truth. The main skein has patterns and areas of density and thickness, and it moves. It's rippling around us as I speak. But that isn't what you're here to see today. Overlaying the main skein is something else. It's easier to show you. Max? Apparently she wasn't abbreviating the word maximum. The man sitting next to her nodded and his lips moved, though Talon didn't catch what he said. All movement in the room ceased. Seated workers' arms fell to their sides and walkers halted in their tracks. The lights went out. In a heartbeat, millions of lines flashed to life. Fluorescent green, they snaked from person to person, object to object, ran across the floor and pierced the ceilings and walls at all angles. The lines ranged in thickness from mere threads to dense, brilliant bands. Thick, bright cables ran between Talon, her children, and Wright. More bands ran from them all to Arthur. Prentice said, "Thanks, that'll do, Max." The lights came on, and the lines winked out of existence. Except, of course, they had not. They still existed, invisible to human sight. Their traces were burning in Talon's retinas. "What you saw was not the main skein," Prentice said. "That's much, much more complicated, and we don't have the computing power to even begin to map it yet, though we're getting there. The connections you saw was what for the moment we're calling the secondary skein. I doubt that name's going to last. We're starting to see divisions and layers in the secondary skein we'll be able to classify soon. Anyway, that's a bit more technical than necessary. Any questions?"
"As I understand it," said Wright, "some of these connections are pre-existing and some are created by actions. Is that correct?"
"Yes, that's one of the classifications we're working on. There's more to it, but that's the gist. We don't know enough to define the exact distinction yet." Arthur said,
"And it's this map that's leading us away from Earth again, out to—"
Prentice held up her hands to stop him. "I know what you're referring to, but I can't discuss it here. My aim today is to show you the framework. You saw the connections between you all and the basic idea of the secondary skein. The implications of all this is something we're still working on. As far as you're concerned, you can discuss the finer details with your superiors."
"TJ," said Arthur, "what we just saw must have been what Merlin was studying the night we found Talon in the wilderness. He must be able to see the invisible patterns."
"You mean when I was on my way back from Anise Morn?" asked Talon. "I always wondered how you managed that." Wright nodded.
"Merlin spent a while concentrating, then he seemed to know roughly where you were."
"But if the aliens can read the skein," Talon mused, she asked Prentice, "do these lines show the future?" The woman's features brightened in excitement, but she only said, "That's currently under investigation. I'm sorry, I don't think I can risk telling you much more. The demonstration was mostly for your children, to help their understanding." Kayla folded her arms across her chest and a line formed between her brows as if she felt insulted. Talon said, "So next it's—" She read Wright's look. "Don't tell me Colburn's going to speak to us too." Chapter 5. Arthur left the elevator at the second floor above ground level, promising to be in touch to arrange horse riding lessons with Patron. On the 10th floor, Prentice escorted Talon and the children to a room and asked them to wait while she took Wright somewhere else. The room was bare, save for a table and a few seats. Talon and Patron sat down, and Kaylin wandered to the large wall interface. She tried to activate it, swiping the screen. "I don't think you're supposed to do that," Talon said. Kayla grimaced. "It doesn't work anyway." Talon suspected it did work, only it didn't work for Kayla or anyone else without the proper security clearance. "How long do we have to wait?" Kayla asked. "I don't know. Not long, I hope." Kayla pulled her personal screen from her pocket and after fiddling with it exclaimed, "This doesn't work either." "It's most likely jammed," Talon explained. "This place must have the highest security in the country." Kayla ambled to the clear wall separating the room from the corridor and leaned on it, staring out morosely. "This is so boring," she told the glass.
"We've been here less than 5 minutes," Patron said, "and the skein mapping room was pretty great."
"I suppose so, but did it really tell us anything we don't already know? Of course we're attached to each other. We're family. Except, she turned and faced her brother. Did you notice you and the king were strongly connected? The line between you two is almost as thick as Mam and TJ's.
I didn't notice, Patron said. It must be the horse riding. I'm looking forward to that.
Talon didn't think it could be something as inconsequential as a mutual love of horses that tied her son to Arthur. She hadn't noticed Kayla's observation, and she found the news disturbing, even though she didn't know what it meant. The minutes stretched out. Brigadier Colburn was taking her sweet time in coming to see them. Talon guessed she had a lot to talk about with Wright. That was also disturbing. She hated the thought of him returning to service. As well as the danger involved in his job, she wasn't sure he was up to it psychologically. He hid his mental troubles well, but some things he couldn't hide from her, such as the nightmares that jolted him from sleep on a regular basis and moments of nervous distraction when she was sure he was having flashbacks. Every so often someone would walk past in the corridor and Kayla would unashamedly follow them with her gaze. Talon contemplated telling her to knock it off and sit down, but no one seemed bothered by the young girl's scrutiny. A pair of workers stopped right outside their room for a chat.
I wonder what they're talking about, Kayla asked. Skein stuff, Patron replied. Probably things you wouldn't even understand.
Like you would understand it?
I bet I'd get it better than you. We've studied Skeins at school, just the basics, but...
Just because you studied it doesn't mean you understand it. Talon was about to tell the kids to quit bickering when the people outside concluded their chat and one of them walked away, right through the other person. Did you see that? Kayla asked, turning, her eyes wide and mouth agape.
She must be a hollow, said Patron.
Has to be. I wonder how many of the people here aren't here at all. Was Dr. Prentice a hollow too? Talon had heard rumours of hollows that could move around, but she didn't know how they worked. Were projectors built into the fabric of the building? What feedback did the person operating as a hollow receive? The encounter between the two workers had seemed entirely natural. She guessed the person who wasn't here experienced a real-time virtual mock-up of the working environment. If only they could send hollows of themselves on the mission the BA was proposing. She would agree to that in a heartbeat, but she doubted that was the case. Colburn appeared outside the transparent window, and Kayla drew back at the sight of the stern woman. The door slid open, and the brigadier entered, all officious no-nonsense attitude. Didn't she ever relax? Talon imagined the officer in a swimsuit lying on a beach sipping a cocktail and stifled a giggle. Colburn shot her a murderous glance. I am here to give you a brief summary of the Alliance's mission proposal. As civilians, you are not obliged to participate, though in my opinion it would be unpatriotic, irresponsible, and undutiful for you to refuse. She bestowed another withering glare on Talon before continuing. Until and unless you sign a binding contract agreeing to the mission parameters, I am somewhat hamstrung about what I can tell you. However, I will do my best. That was it. No greeting, no introduction, no friendly small talk to put the kids at their ease. The brigadier touched the room's interface and it lit up. Why wouldn't it do that for me? Kayla whined. The look Colburn gave her made her shrink into the wall. Speaking between her teeth, Colburn ordered her to sit down. Kayla instantly did as she was told. Talon gave her daughter a sympathetic smile. She knew only too well how scary Colburn was, especially to a young girl whose life had been mostly easy and comfortable. One thing you must understand, Ellis, the brigadier said. If you do agree to join the mission, your children will undergo extensive training. She looked at Patron and Kayla as if she had just wiped them off her shoe. Talon clenched her hands into fists. "Now be quiet and listen," said Colburn. Later, when they'd returned home and eaten dinner, Wright reminded Talon of their planned walk along the cliff-top path. After checking Caris wasn't going out and Patron and Kayla wouldn't be alone, they left. The place Wright had picked for their evening walk was one Talon had taken him to in the early days after he'd got back from his journey into deep space. It was one of her favourite walks, though it was far from home, so she didn't come here often. Small villages were the only habitations in the area, which meant the pathway was never busy. On a weekday at dusk, it was predictably empty. A stiff, cool breeze blew in, and on the sea below, nearly invisible in the darkness, moonlight and starlight sparkled on foam-topped waves. Wright's warm hand wrapped around hers, they set off along the edge of the cliff. He didn't speak, but that wasn't unusual. Wright had never been a talker. She was also quiet, thinking about the day's events. After a while she asked, "How do you feel about this trip? Have you made up your mind?"
"Have you?"
"I'm interested to hear what you have to say first." She bit her lip. "You know you can always resign."
"I know. I've considered it, but I suppose we're each waiting to hear the other's decision."
"I suppose so. My biggest problem is it isn't only myself I'd be committing to the trip. I have my kids to think about too."
"So have I."
She was touched. She'd been uncertain about how Wright and her children would work out their relationships, but things seemed to be going okay.
"Let's stop here," he said.
She looked out over the dark, silver-speckled expanse, the salt-laden wind in her face. In the past there would have been lights from container ships far out to sea. Nowadays freight was transported underwater in huge metal leviathans, quietly powered by high-storage batteries, leaving the ocean surfaces clear of everything except leisure craft. Thanks to the scientific revelations the anonymous friends of humanity had divulged, the world was changing incredibly fast, and for the better. She couldn't imagine what it would look like even 5 years from now. The question that had been plaguing her ever since the Alliance had first proposed the new mission returned. Despite all she'd learned today, she was no closer to a decision. There seemed to be no correct choice. But maybe there was. Maybe it was all that simple. She sensed Wright move beside her.
"Talon."
She turned to face him, only to see empty space. He'd gone down on one knee. Shocked, she took a step backward. He grabbed her wrist.
"Careful, you'll go over the edge."
What are you doing?" Releasing her, he reached in his pocket and took out a small box. Her heart thumped. Everything had suddenly become surreal. He opened the box, revealing a ring.
"Taylan Ellis, will you marry me?"
There was an awkward pause. "But we don't need to get married."
"Yes, we do. I do."
"You're so traditional."
"I know. What's your answer?"
She blinked back tears. "Yes, of course it's yes. On one condition." Chapter 6. Carla Orr studied the hollow of the ship's schematics sourly. Acquiring the information had taken no end of machinations, bribery and blackmail. In the old days it would have been easier. Now, though she retained some power as the Dweir, it was nothing compared to the control she'd once exerted. The Alliance and Prime Minister Jonter had done their work effectively during her 9 years' absence from Earth, held prisoner aboard the Dauntless. The place where she was forced to live was a perfect example of her reduced circumstances. She loathed the modern mansion the BI government had allotted her. She despised the boring, plain rooms and fully comprehensive range of automated services. Where was the personal touch in a laundry machine? Where was the love and awe of the arcane in a food printer? The ancient castles she had once called home had been returned to public ownership and were now filled with gawking tourists, ignorant and unappreciative of their history and atmosphere. Lifting her lip in disgust, she returned her attention to the ghostly lines of the ship hanging in front of her. She had rarely bothered herself with technical details of the Crusade's vessels, but even to her untrained eye there was something odd about these ones. The deck's sections, weapons and engine were clearly outlined, though the engine seemed smaller than usual. All the familiar parts were here, but whoever had created the plans had differentiated between the construction materials using colours and shading. What did the differences mean? "What's that, Mother?" "Perin." She hastily closed the hollow and snapped, "Don't sneak up on me. You gave me a fright." "I don't think you've ever been frightened in your entire life, and I wasn't sneaking anywhere. I can't help it if you're in one of your trances. What were you looking at?" "None of your business." "Was it a starship?" "I said—" "It was a starship. I recognize the format. I remember recording the plan of the Brez." "Oh, you do you? Do you also remember blabbing about arranging the explosion aboard her?" His jaw clenched, and he replied through his teeth, "I was a kid, and it was Morgan's idea. How long are you going to hold that over me?" "As long as it takes for me to return to the position I was once in. It was because of your stupid mistake I had to leave Earth for nearly a decade. If the BA hadn't been able to threaten me with exposing you—" "We've been over this I don't know how many times. Do you have to keep reminding me? When are you going to let it go?" She rose to her feet and stalked toward him. "You have no idea what I had to endure out there. No idea." The memory of John's ghost silently reproaching her, it seemed, for all she had done, sprang vividly into her mind. She halted and took a breath. "No idea," she repeated, a catch in her voice. "That's all in the past now. You need to get over it." Dragging herself back to the present, she regarded the young man standing before her. He'd grown tall in her absence, but his dark hair and dark eyes were the same. There could be no doubt he was her son. Yet she felt she hardly knew him. The BA had completed the work Morgan Le Fay had begun. It had severed him from her. Perin was no longer hers. The bond was gone. But perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps she could bind him to her again. Conceived when the Horned One came to her in the guise of many men one night in an oak grove, and born through great pain and joy, he was her blood. Nothing could change that. The world was changing, however. The secrets revealed to humankind had been revelatory. The stupid scientists were finally beginning to understand the great truths of the universe, things she had understood and accepted for most of her life. She had been right all along. Not that anyone had given her credit for it. The Alliance's propaganda had turned the image of the Crusade into a quaint, quirky movement, its members batty but essentially harmless. "What are you thinking, Mother?" Perin asked, looking at her strangely. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," she retorted hotly. Then, calmer, she said, "Come here and sit down." She returned to the sofa and patted it. He joined her, looking somewhat wary. "This trip the BA plan on taking us on," she said. "What do you think about it?" "I think it's exciting. It's been years since I was aboard a starship. You do realize we'll be traveling into interstellar space, don't you? Aren't you afraid?" "Should I be? You haven't told me much about your time on the Dauntless. What was it you had to endure? What made it so bad?" "Things out there are different from how they are on Earth. Out there's no telling what might happen.
and the Defiant will be heading for a new, different section of the galaxy."
"The Defiant?" His eyes widened. "Is that the ship's name? Was that its plans you were looking at just now? It was, wasn't it? Where did you get them?" He stood and backed away from her.
"You have to destroy the files. You'll get us both in trouble." "Sit down," she hissed, glaring.
Slowly he complied. It was gratifying to discover she still held sway over him.
"Listen, you are my son, Perin, and for that reason, and that reason alone, I forgive you for being a snivelling, whining failure. What happened to you while I was gone? What did they do to you?"
His expression hardened, but he didn't answer.
"You weren't a small child when I left, or rather was forced to leave. You must remember the days of the crusade, the rites and rituals, the adoration of our followers."
"I remember," he said sullenly.
"Do you recall our time on the Belladonna, when Morgan taught you telepathy?"
"That was only a trick. It wasn't real." He wouldn't meet her gaze, no doubt ashamed of his betrayal when she tried to escape with him.
"It was real. Let's try now, shall we? Close your eyes and try to speak to me with your mind."
"No, it's stupid." She put the idea to one side. For her, it had been less than a year since she'd practiced telepathy, but for Perin it had been half a lifetime ago. It was perfectly possible he'd simply forgotten how to do it.
"Another time, maybe," she said. "It isn't important. Perin, I forgive you for allowing the Alliance to run roughshod over everything I worked for. You were young when I left, and you were alone, lacking a guiding hand. But I'm back now. I've been back for months. Whenever I try to speak to you about how things were and how they should be, you rebuff me. You act as though everything I ever believed in, everything we believed in, is a nonsense. Can't you see how hurtful and disappointing that is to me?"
"I guess so," he muttered. Still, he wouldn't look at her.
"Despite everything that's happened, no matter what anyone has told you, I am your mother. Don't you think I know what's best for you?"
He shrugged. She wasn't reaching him. She decided to try a different tactic.
"Do you remember the day I attempted to launch an invasion of Ireland? The speech on the quay, Arthur's approach through the crowd?"
"How could I forget it?"
"He murdered so many of my followers in cold blood in his effort to reach me. Do you think that was right?"
"Of course not, but—" He frowned. "There was a man tied to the front of our procession vehicle. Who was he, and why was he covered in cuts?" Grimacing, she replied,
"Sometimes running an empire requires the performance of distasteful acts. That man was a traitor, but the people Arthur killed were innocent. Think about it. Who were the evil ones then? Us or the Alliance?"
"That was ages ago. The Britannic Isles are peaceful now. People are mostly happy." She gritted her teeth. Happy? When did happiness ever count for anything? Chapter 7. "I can't do it," Taylan exclaimed. "And I don't understand how you can even ask me." Wright put his head in his hands. They had been going over the same topic for hours. He was sick of it. She had to be sick of it too. But he couldn't give up. It was too important. He understood her concerns, but why couldn't she see his point of view? She didn't seem to want to give an inch. When he looked up, she'd moved to the living room window and was staring out of it, her arms folded across her chest. "You know what I went through," she murmured. Turning to face him, she continued, "You know what it did to me and how I nearly lost them. They were just kids. They've suffered enough, and so have I. You saw what the trial did to Patron. He was a mess. It's time we put it all behind us. Patron deserves to live a happy, normal life, and so does Kayla. I'm not dragging them into the Alliance's harebrained scheme. Everyone's acting like it isn't insanely dangerous. We'd be going up against beings vastly superior to us, with abilities and technology we can only guess at. I'm not going to subject my children to that. She was silhouetted in the darkening room, her back to the window, so he couldn't make out her face, but her tone had risen, trembling as she spoke. She went on, "And if that means you and I have to be separated again, so be it." There it was. That was the real point of their argument. If she didn't agree to join the mission, they would be living at different speeds. While he was gone, time would pass on Earth faster than it would aboard the Defiant. When he returned, she could be decades older than him, or possibly dead. The physicists had said the new method of space travel, passing through seams in space-time like areas of dead current in an ocean, meant the rules of relativity didn't apply in the same way. There would be some variance in the speed time passed, but they weren't exactly sure how much. If she didn't come with him, their relationship would essentially be over. She said softly, "I thought I mattered to you, that we all mattered to you." He gasped and strode across the room to grab her into a hug. "You do matter to me, more than I can say. You mean the world to me." She muttered into his shoulder, limp in his arms, "But the Alliance means more." "No!" He held her arms and looked into her eyes, shadowy in the twilight. "This isn't just another job. If it weren't for this mission, I would have resigned the minute I disembarked the Dauntless. I was done. In fact, I was done after Jamaica. I should have left then. I'm not sure why I didn't, but I'm glad I stuck around. You said these beings we saw as Merlin and Morgan are incredibly dangerous. That's right. That's exactly why we must do something about them now, while we still can. And we can't leave it to other people to do it. It was me the aliens spoke to when they exploded our scientific understanding, and that means something. Can you imagine what might have happened if it had been Arthur or Carla Orr? But why did they contact you in particular? Did they explain?" "No, but they initially tried to speak to all three of us due to the connections they saw. They first came to me looking like my father." "Your dad?" "They seemed to pick up on significant figures from our past. For Arthur, it was Guinevere, and for Orr, some old guy she used to know. The point is, they could see these things we don't comprehend yet, even with everything they've told us. These connections are significant, and if there's a strong link between you, me, your children and Arthur, as well as all the other links the Skein mappers have discovered, it's important. I don't know how or why, but—" "We've been over this so many times." She broke away from him. "I keep telling you I don't care. I'm not going to join the mission, and I won't give permission for Patron or Kayla to join it either. Who knows what might happen to them? I'm not putting my kids in danger. I would be a reckless, neglectful parent if I did. What you do is up to you. It would have been nice to get married, but if you insist on doing this, I don't see much point. We should just try to do our best to enjoy our time together before you leave." "Taylan, I don't want to leave without you." He wasn't sure he even could. Looking at her standing before him, he imagined the wrench it would be to tear himself from her side. The experience on the Dauntless had been terrible. He didn't know if he could do it again. Yet if he didn't, he wasn't sure how it might impact the future of humanity. In a way, he wished he could see things through her narrow, focused scope, but he couldn't. "You realize you could be jeopardizing your children's future?" He felt bad hitting her below the belt, but he didn't see any alternative. "Huh? By refusing to allow them to travel into unknown danger? She asked icily. Explain that. He hesitated. There was so little he could tell her.
We have free will, that's clear. Some connections are formed by our actions, but there's also a natural passage of things. The map indicates it. The alien told me the Dauntless was smashing through the web of connections, that there were easier and less destructive routes to take. If we, you, don't follow the indications, no one knows what might happen.
No one knows what'll happen if I do.
We are currently heading for a better world for all humankind, right? But what if Merlin and Morgan return soon? They don't give a shit about us. We're like ants to them. What do you think Earth will be like for Patron and Kayla then, and their children's world? We have to try to put a stop to their interference. Our new knowledge of the Skein seems to give us a chance, but only if we put it to use. Otherwise we remain ignorant, barely sentient beings, smashing through the spider's silk wherever we go.
That's hypothetical. You're trying to scare me, and it isn't fair.
What choice do I have when you won't listen to reason?
I'm not the one being unreasonable here.
But you are. Weren't you there at the Institute with me? Didn't you see the patterns?
I saw a lot of pretty lights, yes. That doesn't mean I have to pay attention to them.
Now look,
said Wright, his ire rising.
You're being disingenuous. It was the connections that led you to your children out in Australia. It was all due to what Arthur told you about recognizing the pattern. You didn't believe him at first, but in the end you had to admit he was right. That's what you told me.
She was silent.
If it wasn't for you following the connections, Patron and Kayla would have died in the desert. That's true, isn't it?
Still, she didn't reply.
Answer me.
I want you to leave, she said quietly.
What?
I want you to go. Now. Take what you need for tonight. When you know your address, I'll send the rest of your stuff on. He stared at her.
Come on, Talon. You're being ridiculous. We're just having a discussion.
Take your things, she hissed, and get out. He froze, watching her, trying to figure out what was going on. How had their argument suddenly transformed into a breakup? It was the last thing he wanted. The door chimes sounded. Kayla's footsteps resounded from the staircase as she bounded down. She had a thing about answering the front door. It hadn't been by chance, it had been Kayla who had opened it when Wright had arrived at Taylan's house 2 months ago, when he'd desperately hoped she still loved him. Could everything really be over? "Uncle Lorcan," came Kayla's happy voice from the hall. "It's been ages. Come in." The hall light turned on and Kayla stuck her head into the living room. "Uncle Lorcan's here." Quizzically she continued, "Why are you standing in the dark?" She turned on the light and returned to the hall.
"Uncle Lorcan?"
Wright asked. He could see Talon's face properly now, including the tracks of tears on her cheeks. He felt an absolute bastard. She wiped her face with the cuff of her shirt. "Yes, it's Talman. He comes around sometimes. We haven't seen him for a while, not since you got back." The man himself stepped into the living room. His trademark red hair had turned white, and he was stooped and frail-looking. The years of the Dauntless's voyage had passed heavily for him. "Good evening, Talon. Ah, I recognize your other visitor. It's Major Wright, isn't it? I remember you." Not bothering to offer an update on his rank, Wright shook Talman's offered hand.
"You have a good memory. I have to confess, I didn't expect to see you here."
Kayla had skipped to the liquor cabinet and was pouring whiskey into a tumbler. "I pop in now and then," said Talman. "I like to check how Patron and Kayla are doing, and it's nice to have a touch of normality once in a while." "Do you want to sit outside on the patio?" Kayla asked. It's a beautiful evening. That's a very good idea. It is indeed a lovely evening. Perhaps you two would like to join me for a small tipple? He asked Talon and Wright, glancing from one to the other as if sensing the tension between them. I will, Talon replied. In a minute. Wright's just about to leave. I'm sorry to hear it. I would have liked a chat. Perhaps he could stay a short while and indulge an old man. He was asking Talon. All right, she replied sullenly. If you like. Talman followed Kayla out of the living room, heading for the back of the house. Wright was entirely nonplussed, trying to wrap his head around the fact that the richest man in the world was in Talon's home. She seemed to guess his confusion. Lorcan started dropping by not long after the Dauntless left. He would talk to the kids about how they were getting on, ask to see their school reports, things like that. I think he guessed I was a single mum and he was trying to be a father figure to them. Seeing them seemed to help him too in some way, though I'm not sure. He never explained why he was here, but over time the kids have grown to love him. They're very lucky. I know. And, she added, her tone hardening, I want them to stay that way. Outside the sun had set and the back garden was warm and peaceful. Small bats swooped through the dusky sky, gathering flying insects. Talman sat at the patio table, his tumbler in hand, quietly talking to Kayla. Ah, right. Glad you could stay, but neither of you has a drink. I'll get them, Kayla piped. What do you want? When they gave their answer, she trotted into the house. Wright pulled out a slatted seat and sat down. The end of the garden was only just visible. He recalled seeing Talon there for the first time in 9 years, sparring with Patron. He'd thought the nearly fully grown boy was Talon's new man and had been so relieved to discover he wasn't. He hadn't imagined this final mission would drive them apart after such a short time together. In an attempt to distract himself from his pain, he said to Lorcan, When I got back, I was surprised to find out your colony ships were still here. Weren't they supposed to leave years ago? The man had sipped his whiskey. He sucked in a breath through thinned lips before replying, They were, but when the scientific revelations arrived, I realized I couldn't allow the colonization project to go ahead as it was. We've worked through everything again, right from the basics up. We had to strip the ships down to their frames and rebuild them. That must have been a massive effort. Massive and extremely time-consuming. Hence the years of delay. But if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing well. Though we've lost time now, we'll more than make up for it on the outward journey. He smiled. Not that all the prospective colonists understand, and some have died waiting, unfortunately. We've had to hand out plenty of refunds, but there are always people ready and waiting to take the empty spots. Kayla returned and handed Talon a glass of wine and another tumbler of whiskey to Wright. Are you still going? Wright asked. Talman's project had been his life for decades. It had seemed the main reason for his existence. Perhaps not. I'm an old man. As time has worn on, my passion has faded, and I have no interest in the stars and other planets anymore. The point of what I was doing got lost along the way. Somehow I've learned contentment. He turned his attention from the shadowy garden to Wright and Talon. But don't let my experience put you two off. The Alliance doesn't let me in on many of their secrets these days, but I know about the Defiant. The trip sounds very exciting. Talon remained stubbornly silent. Probably more challenging than exciting, said Wright. The voyage on the Dauntless was no joke. You have my best wishes for success, though I doubt I'll still be alive when you return. He added pointedly, You'll have each other. That's the main thing. You're very fortunate. I wish I'd had longer with Grace and my children. Alas, it was not to be. If I were to give one piece of unsolicited advice to young couples, it would be to cherish what you have. You never know when it'll be taken from you." With a heavy heart, Wright stepped over the threshold of the hotel. His ID had been read by the scanner built into the wall. The hotel was one of those fully automated places with no human staff on site. A hollow map of the building's layout appeared in the lobby, the empty rooms highlighted. If he had a neural net, the image would have appeared only in his vision. He figured out the nearest available room and headed for it. He hadn't brought any of his things from Talon's home. He didn't need anything for tonight, and he could buy whatever he needed. He had left nothing sentimental there. He didn't have anything sentimental. The door opened at his touch. From now until he checked out, it wouldn't open for anyone else except hotel staff. The innovations were piling up. What would the world look like when he returned? He wondered what the Crusaders made of all the changes. After quickly showering, he climbed between the cold sheets. Some things never changed. Hotels were as soulless and anonymous as always. Sleep usually came quickly to him, but this night was different. He lay painfully awake for hours, ruminating. He'd tried everything he could think of, but he couldn't seem to get through to Talon. At the end of the day, it was her decision. She couldn't be compelled to join the mission, and Kayla and Patron were minors. She had the final say on her children's inclusion. Patron would turn 18 this year, but his birthday fell after the scheduled departure date. Finally, with Talon's averted, tear-streaked face in his mind's eye, he must have fallen asleep, for something was waking him up. At first he thought it was his comm, and he mentally answered it, but then he realized the bleeping sound was external. He opened his eyes on darkness, lit by the flashing of the room's interface. It was still night time. He must have only been asleep a short while. He opened the screen, but the caller was using only audio, not video. "Right?" The speaker's voice was thick with long crying and sorrow, but it was unmistakable.
"Talon, are you okay?"
"I was wrong. I'm sorry."
"What?"
"I hate the thought of putting Kayla and Patron in danger. But you were right about how Arthur helped me to find them. What he said about patterns turned out to be true. We'll come on the mission." He sat up.
"You will? You're sure?"
"I'm sure. I was only scared about what might happen to the kids. It's my job to protect them."
"I know. I get it. I really do. But if you'll come, that's fantastic."
"We will." A pause. "I love you."
"I love you too."
There was another pause. Then Talon said, "Right?"
"Yes."
"Come home." Chapter 8. The Skein mappers had been busy. Hans scanned the list of names they'd sent him. Each person was supposedly connected to the alien invasion of human society. How they were connected, why they were involved, no one could say. Only that a band of mysterious origin ran thick and true between these people. Not all of the names on the list were even BI citizens. Several were from Australia, one was from St. Kitts, and another was from Hawaii. How could they possibly be associated? Probably, if a researcher investigated their backgrounds, links would be found. In his years in espionage, he'd often stumbled across unlikely relationships between subjects, relationships of which they were entirely unaware. CEOs who are distant cousins of families their corporations were screwing over, an assassin tasked with the murder of his grandmother's first love, a spy bleeding state secrets from the daughter of a woman his brother dallied with in a holiday romance decades ago. Connections, connections, connections. His career had been built on them, and now it seemed the fate of humanity rested on them too. Were humans ever to be vulnerable to interference from a more developed species, or could they achieve true autonomy? And if so, how? The answer seemed to lie in the list on the screen, but its significance was as opaque to him as it was to everyone else. It was not a position he liked to be in. His confidence and comfort lay in being one step ahead of his opponents. But this was something different. This was an act of faith. He would have to let go and trust the process. Word had come through that Taylan Ellis was on board, so that was something. She was highly skilled and resourceful, though she had a knack for getting herself and others, including him, into trouble. His sources told him she was in a romantic relationship with Lieutenant Colonel Wright, another mission member. His feelings about Wright were not so sanguine. The BA thought highly of the man, but in Hans's personal experience he was unreliable. It couldn't be helped. Like the unfathomable pattern they had chosen to follow, including Wright was something he had to do on faith. Plus, Talon wouldn't want to leave him behind, as who knew how long the Defiant would be gone. The same applied to her children. He was uncomfortable about sending minors out into deep space. "Sir," said his secretary over the desk comm, "you have 5 minutes until your press conference."
"Thank you."
He rose and walked to his private restroom, where he washed his hands and face. It was a ritual he'd developed over the years of his rise to Prime Minister. The familiar actions centered him, concentrating his focus. Journalists and their questions were the bane of his career, but they were a necessary evil. His ritual helped him marshal his thoughts and anticipate the difficult answers he might have to give, but it was also a reminder of a moment over a decade ago when he had checked his appearance before attending the General Council meeting in Jamaica. The bombing of the event by the combined EAC and Antarctic Project forces had been a watershed. Josephine, his PA at the time, had saved his life, and in doing so lost her own. That action had allowed her twin sister, Maria, to step into her place. Maria, who with her beguiling charms had helped him engineer a military coup of the BI government. Maria, a secret agent of the EAC, who had alerted Carla Orr to the Alliance's vulnerability. Maria, his only true love, who had died a revolutionary. Though she had subjected him to horrible torture, he hoped he was a better person for having known her. He didn't think he had played so fast and loose with people's lives since then. The evidence of his work was all around. The Caribbean had its independence at last. The Britannic Isles was a peaceful, prosperous country, more or less united, and the Earth Awareness Crusade had diminished to a largely powerless group of people with rather odd beliefs. The last he'd heard, the cult was hemorrhaging followers, particularly younger members who had attended regular state schools. Carla Orr still lived, unfortunately, protected only by her significance to humanity's involvement with the aliens, according to the Skein mappers. Perhaps it was for the best. If executed for her many war crimes, she would become a martyr to her people, increasing their religious fervour and perhaps sparking a resurgence of the dangerous movement. He had achieved many things, subtly or overtly. His dream of a BI republic had come true in all but name. Soon King Arthur would leave on another long voyage. Who knew when he would return, if ever? Hopefully, by the time he was back, the citizens of the Isles would inform him he was no longer needed. Hans doubted he would receive any acclaim for what he had done. These days, all he heard were complaints and criticisms. Such was the fate of those burdened with profound responsibilities. The fact didn't particularly bother him. History, not the general public, would be his judge. To fulfill his deepest ambition was enough of a reward. He gazed into the mirror. His beard was greying, and lines surrounded his sagging eyes. Yes, he had reward enough. Only there was a knock at the door. "Sorry to disturb you, sir, but the press are waiting. Should I tell them you've had an unexpected delay?"
"No, I'll be out in a moment."
Had 5 minutes passed so quickly? He took a final look in the mirror. He was content with everything he'd achieved, only it would have been nice if Maria had been by his side. Chapter 9. "The Prime Minister's giving a speech," Kayla called from downstairs. Patron ignored her. Kayla was always getting excited about one thing or another. This time it wasn't the Prime Minister speaking to the media that interested her. It was because Mam had told them she knew Jonta during the war. They'd done some stuff together apparently, though she hadn't explained exactly what. She hadn't been lying. Patron was sure about that. Mam didn't lie or even exaggerate. If she said she'd known Jonta, it was true, but she didn't know him anymore. He wasn't like Uncle Lorcan, who turned up every month or so to check how they were doing, sometimes bringing them a cool present. The PM was just another public figure. He and Mam had nothing to do with each other. He picked up his gloves and went downstairs. "Are you going out?" Kayla asked from the living room, spying him through the open door.
"I go out this exact time every week," he replied, exasperated. "You know why."
"Oh yeah. Hey, come and listen to this. It's about us."
"Huh?"
He stepped into the room. The Prime Minister stood behind a polished wooden lectern on a raised dais in front of his residence. The camera angle took in the tops of the heads of reporters clustered tightly around him, jostling for their positions. Jonta appeared to be answering a question.
"I am not at liberty to discuss the selection criteria, but suffice to say only the very best candidates, most suited to enduring the rigorous challenges of the mission, will be invited to participate."
Someone asked, "Can anyone apply?"
"Absolutely not. Individuals have already been approached on a person-by-person basis."
"But isn't it only military personnel who will be going?" the same journalist urged.
"A range of people from all walks of life have been chosen to represent humanity on this expedition, after an intensive consultation process with our heads of armed forces and scientists working at the forefront of our new understanding."
Patron asked.
"He isn't going public about the Defiant?"
"He hasn't mentioned her by name yet," Kayla replied. "The press seem more interested in who's going, not what ship they'll be aboard." She clasped her hands together. "I wish I could tell my friends. Keeping it a secret is killing me."
"Don't you dare. You'll spoil everything, and then they might not let us go. Besides, your friends could all be grown up by the time we get back. Remember what happened with Mam and TJ? He was gone for 9 years, and she had to wait for him."
"I know, it's so romantic," Kayla gushed. "And now they're getting married. I can't wait for the wedding."
"I can. I'm terrified about being best man."
"Don't be stupid. It'll be awesome. My bridesmaid's dress is beautiful." Jonta had continued his speech while they chatted. As they returned their attention to the screen, he said,
"I'm afraid that's all I have time for today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about this jewel in the crown of the Alliance's achievements. I'm sure you'll join me in wishing the men and women the very best of luck in this monumental endeavour."
Ignoring questions shouted from the audience, Jonta stepped down from the podium. Patron frowned.
"Did he say anything about the alien threat?"
"Nope, didn't mention it at all. He probably doesn't want to scare people." It seemed unfair that the PM hadn't talked about the real reason for the mission. He appeared to be spinning it as an exploratory journey into the unknown, talking up the exciting part and downplaying the risks. Jonta was a typical politician. Patron wasn't sad Mam no longer had anything to do with him. The setup at the riding stables was always the same. 3 black limousines sat outside, professional drivers at their controls, and men and women in dark suits and sunglasses hovered around the entrance. Patron didn't know how Arthur put up with his ever-present retinue. It would annoy the hell out of him to be constantly followed, with never a moment of privacy until you were behind a locked door. Even then, guards would be posted outside 24/7. Was Arthur's home fitted with cameras and listening devices too? Mam had explained it was all because his life was under constant threat from Crusader extremists. The nutcases believed the king had pushed Carla Orr to one side, making her a powerless figurehead. In fact, Mam said, it was the Alliance who had done that, and Arthur was just as much a figurehead as Orr. But it suited the BA to allow the king to be a scapegoat. He walked up to the entrance and sighed as he lifted his arms. The security agents had to recognize him on sight by now, but they still searched him thoroughly every time he arrived for a lesson. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis," said a bald-headed man. He ran his gaze up and down Patron, gently turned him around and then said, "Nothing like the old methods." He patted Patron's legs, felt up his back and sides and into his jacket collar, then turned him around again. The thorough search continued until the man felt the lump in his jacket pocket and took out the gloves. After inspecting them thoroughly, he handed them back. "You can go in. Have a good lesson, kid." The literal rite of passage over, Patron walked through the gates. Arthur was already in the cobbled stable yard, holding the reins of 2 big stallions. The horses had to be large to comfortably carry his and Arthur's weight. Arthur's mount was the bay he always rode, but Patron didn't recognize the other one, a dapple grey. "Who's this?" he asked, reaching out to pat the animal's neck. The horse backed off as if startled, his hooves clattering on the cobbles. "Whoa," said Arthur. "Easy." He had a tight grip on the reins and brought the horse forward again. "This is Beamer." "Like the gun?" Patron appraised the horse. He was beautiful, but his muscles twitched with tension. "Ah, yes, that's what the name means. Justin isn't available today. He's pulled a muscle. The only other horse suitable for you is Beamer, though—" He squinted over his shoulder. "He's a little excitable." "Just a little," Patron said, catching a flash of white in the horse's eyes. "I can ride him instead," Arthur offered. "No, it's okay. I'm sure he'll settle down once we're out on the trail. He probably doesn't get ridden much, so he's full of energy." He took the reins from Arthur and led Beamer the few paces to the mounting block. Once in the saddle, the usual sense of familiarity washed over him. He never felt as home anywhere as he did on a horse's back. He didn't understand it and couldn't explain it, except that the animals had held a fascination for him all his life. The cart horses at the Crusaders' camp in the Australian desert had been about the only positive thing in his life at the time. After his first lesson, Arthur had told him he was a natural and they hadn't ridden in the training ring since the first day. "You lead," said the king. "I'll follow." Patron picked one of the many tracks leading from the stables, one that wound up a wooded slope until it reached an expanse of grassland at the top. No other riders were around. None were allowed while Arthur was present. Patron gave Beamer a light kick and guided him to the trailhead. Soon they were in cool shade beneath the tree's canopy, and his horse was picking his way delicately over roots snaking across the track. Patron leaned forward as the incline increased, and his horse climbed upward, dealing with the extra effort with ease. After 15 minutes riding, they were at the top and broke out into bright sunlight. The tree line continued to their left. On their right, tall grasses undulated in the breeze. Arthur urged his horse forward until they were riding abreast. Unusually for the situation, the king's head was down and he held his reins listlessly.
"Is something wrong?"
Patron asked. All their previous rides had seemed to invigorate him. Patron had thought he'd never seen a man so much in his element. Without looking at him, Arthur replied,
"I have watched you ride many times now, and I have formed an impression I cannot shake. It saddens me." "What kind of impression? Am I doing something wrong?"
Arthur murmured.
"You are your mother's son, and there's nothing I can do about it."
"But why is that bad?" As Patron spoke, crashes resounded from the forest, like several things dropping to the floor and smashing into brambles and bracken. Before Arthur could answer, a figure sprang from under the cover of the trees and sprinted toward them. A flash of light erupted from his hand. He was firing. Where was the security detail? They couldn't gallop out of danger. Though the attacker was on foot, a pulse round could hit Arthur in the back. Patron brought Beamer around, tugging hard on the reins, to put himself and his horse between Arthur and the would-be assassin. Another light flashed somewhere in the woods. More than one cultist must have dropped from the trees, and now the security agents were in battle with them. But no one was protecting Arthur. Patron was an expert with many weapons thanks to Mam's teaching, but he had nothing with him. He kicked Beamer again and rode directly at the Crusader. All his horse's skittishness was gone. Neck outstretched, the animal bore down on the black-clothed figure like a torpedo locked on its target. The man fired again, aiming around Patron, and the pulse flew past so close it nearly blinded him with its glare. No sound came from Arthur, so he assumed the round missed its target. The assassin wavered, his attention flicking from the horse and rider set on a direct course for him and a spot behind them, presumably Arthur. His arm moved fractionally right. Now he was aiming at Patron, who was so close he could see the gun's opening, the small black hole through which would pass the bolt of concentrated energy that would be his death. Even if his resolve had wavered, he had no choice now except to continue on his course. Beamer would not be able to deviate from his path in time to avoid the shot. No horse could. But Patron didn't want to turn aside anyway. The resolve had gripped him like he'd never felt before. He would protect Arthur even at the cost of his own life. A pulse flashed right before his eyes. His vision turned red. He couldn't see a thing. He felt Beamer leap lightly, carrying him upward, and then he landed, softly for a horse his size. His gait slowed. Patron drew on the reins, blinking. He had to stop his mount from running in among the trees where, judging from the hiss of pulse fire and cracking of twigs, the battle between cultists and security agents continued. His sight began to return, the tall green grasses and brown tree trunks swimming into view.
"That was noble and brave of you,"
said Arthur. The king was by his side. Patron looked back to the spot where Beamer had spontaneously jumped. In a patch of flattened grass lay the body of the Crusader, his chest collapsed into a charred, smoking hole. Confused, Patron looked at Arthur again, and this time he noticed he was holding a gun.
"I've been practicing with this lately," said the king, lifting the weapon. "That was a good shot, don't you think?"
Patron swallowed.
"Yes, a very good shot."
Arthur leaned closer, rising up in his stirrups, before saying conspiratorially,
"We'd better not mention this to your mother."
Chapter 10. "How very hands," Talon remarked. The PM had arranged a farewell ceremony for the mission members, along with a publicity shoot. The men and women soon to board the Defiant stood in a line outside the shuttle that would fly them to the ship, surrounded by press reps. Jonta walked slowly along the line, shaking each person's hand and chatting with them briefly before moving on. The ceremony had been marketed as being about the people embarking on the voyage into deep space, travelling farther than any human had ever been. It was supposed to be a public thank you for their sacrifice, putting their lives on the line, postponing their futures. But of course it was all propaganda. The intention was to make Hans look humble yet powerful, and to polish the BI government's image. Once the Defiant had departed, the mission would quickly be forgotten, no longer the news of the day. Comms from the ship would arrive instantly on Earth, but at the speed she travelled, they would be years and possibly even decades apart. It all depended on how far the Defiant had to go before the anticipated encounter with the extraterrestrial life forms. The Skein mappers had been vague about her final destination. They had some idea about where the connections from Earth into outer space converged, but the region discovered so far was vast, light years across. They'd said they would have a better idea as time went on, and they would comm the ship with more exact coordinates, but there was no guarantee they would ever pinpoint it exactly.
Talon.
The PM had arrived. Hans. She smiled wickedly, winding him up by using his first name when everyone else had called him Prime Minister or Sir. He smiled back. He knew what she was doing and didn't mind. She liked that about him. He had no airs or graces.
I'm sorry we didn't get to spend more time together after your return from Australia. Unfortunately, the demands of public office.
I understand. I would have liked to see you too, but you were busy rebuilding the BI. That was an important job, and you've done it well.
Thank you. That means a lot to me, coming from you. You always speak your mind.
Some wouldn't put it so politely, but you're right. If I didn't mean it, I wouldn't say it.
Good luck, Talon. When you return, come and see me. I'll make time. It's been an honor to know you.
He shook her hand firmly, then he moved on. She reeled from his compliment. Considering she'd nearly got him hanged, the praise was unexpected. But perhaps he didn't really mean it. In some ways he was her polar opposite. He'd probably never spoken his mind in his entire life. It didn't matter. She took a last look at Jonta's profile and then stared into the distance, waiting for the ceremony to be over. She'd seen some familiar faces as the mission members arrived and was itching to say hi to some of them. Not all, but most. It was the first time most of the team had been together. The motley group was to form the core of the Enterprise, supported by Royal Marines, Skein advisors and auxiliary staff. They comprised the people whose connections were tightly woven, like the core of a spider's web. Most of them wore the mission uniform, navy blue with gold trimming. Talon's was uncomfortably tight and hot. It was horrible to be in uniform again. The grey airfield baked under the hot afternoon sun, entirely empty to the fields at its edge. All aircraft except for the shuttle were in the hangars, and the skies had been made a no-fly zone. Crusader attacks had ramped up recently, possibly in response to the Dweir's imminent departure. She and her loathsome son were two of the few not present. They would have no public farewell. Hans's spin doctors had made up a lie about her being unwell and Perin unwilling to leave her side. Both had been transported directly to the Defiant yesterday. Talon looked to the side. Hans had nearly reached the end of the line. Thank the stars. She risked reaching for Wright's hand, now the two of them were out of close scrutiny. He frowned at her, no doubt disapproving the break in acceptable behaviour, but he didn't pull his hand away as she lightly held his fingertips. The Prime Minister posed for some more shots with the mission team in the background, and then the ordeal was finally over. As he climbed into his limousine, Talon slumped in relief. They were waved onto the shuttle, and the media closed in to gather more images for the world's news agencies. "Lieutenant Colonel Wright," a voice shouted from the audience. "Is it true you and another mission member got married recently?" Wright ignored the speaker, but Talon looked over her shoulder. The reporter, a young woman, noticed her behaviour and pushed forward. "Are you Mrs. Wright? How do you feel about taking part in the mission? Is that why you were chosen? Because you're the Lieutenant Colonel's wife?" They were forbidden from speaking to the press in any way, shape or form. Otherwise, Talon might have given the woman a piece of her mind. But the question showed how ignorant the world's population was of what was really going on. They had no idea about how the Skeins worked or their significance.
"Get aboard before they ask any more stupid questions."
She took a final look at the scene around the shuttle. The plain, hot, empty airfield, the mob of gawking reporters, distant yellowing grass, and crystal clear blue sky. It was her last vision of Earth for who knew how long. Patron walked ahead of her into the passenger cabin, closely followed by Kayla. He picked a row of 4 seats and they all sat down, Talon in an aisle seat. The trip had finally begun. "Hey, it's good to see you again," said a young man sitting down across from her. "Kevin!" She reached out and gripped his hand. "Damn, it's good to see you too." She was forced to let go of him to allow the other passengers to pass by. "I remember you saying you didn't want to visit the Isles. Bet you never thought you'd be here, let alone boarding a flight to a starship. It's hotter than I thought it'd be. We do have the occasional warm day." She couldn't stop grinning at him. "Where's Arthur?" Kevin asked. "I thought he was coming too." "He has his own farewell ceremony. We'll see him tomorrow." "Yeah, while I remember, thanks for not telling me he was the freaking king of the Britannic Isles. I wouldn't have let him ride my motorbike if I'd known." "No problem. Arthur prefers it when people don't recognise him. He hates all the deference and special treatment." "Oh." She'd just spotted a line of 4 approaching up the aisle. Reacquainting herself with these people would be less pleasant.
"Talon?"
Maylir passed by. Madog was next. He nodded at her. Medwin moved past as if she didn't exist. Mark bent down for a quick hug and whispered, "Talk later." A woman followed him, the last to board the shuttle. "Remember me?" she asked. "Seren! As if I could forget. I thought I would never see you again." Seren had aged a little, but she looked as sweet and pretty as ever. Anyone who didn't know her would never guess she'd been a linchpin in the BI resistance. "To be honest," Seren said, "I don't know why I'm here. I don't think the organisers know much more than we do, but I'm glad you came." "I had to. It was either that or split up with Mark, and neither of us wanted that."
"Please take your seats,"
a voice announced over the intercom. But the shuttle didn't take off right away. Colburn appeared from the pilot's cabin. "Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who haven't met me yet, I am Brigadier Colburn, one of the officers in charge of this mission. I am the conduit between the civilian and military sections of the crew, and your port of call regarding any problems in this area. However, be aware I value my time, and I won't waste it on spurious nonsense." Her disdain for everything and everyone non-military was almost palpable. "I am also the person who will provide you with mission updates. I am here to announce there has been a slight change of plan. We will be arriving at the Defiant in 4 hours as scheduled, but we will not be departing the solar system directly. The ship will dock at Mars Station for upgrades and to pick up the remaining mission members. That is all. Please prepare for takeoff." Chapter 11. The cool, filtered air of a starship washed over Talon as she boarded the Defiant, the unique scent evoking powerful emotions. She associated being aboard a spacefaring vessel with being separated from her kids, never knowing if she would see them again, or even if they were alive. They were right here beside her, but despair and fear welled up, and she reached out to touch them. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Patron asked. Wright, perhaps misinterpreting her expression for regret, put an arm around her.
"You made the right decision, I'm sure of it."
Then his arm slid away as he saluted. Colburn returned the salute. "Welcome aboard, Lieutenant Colonel." The Brigadier ran an icy stare over Talon, Patron and Kayla before stalking off without saying a word to them. "Why does that old woman hate us?" Kayla asked, long before Colburn was out of hearing range. Colburn's back stiffened, but she didn't break stride.
"Shh," said Wright. "Brigadier Colburn is a Royal Marine officer. She deserves our respect."
"No, she doesn't," said Talon. "Kayla, she hates us because she's a bitter old witch, not because we did anything wrong."
"Talon,"
Wright admonished. "It's true," she continued to her daughter. "She hates almost everyone except Wright. Don't take it personally." "Okay," Kayla blithely replied. "Where's my cabin? This is so exciting." She had gathered her duffel bag into her arms and was squeezing it to her chest. The packing of the bag had been a prolonged, complicated exercise involving many complaints and hard decisions about what to bring and what to leave behind. The volume and weight restriction for luggage applied to all mission members equally, regardless of the size of their wardrobe. In the end, Talon had given Kayla half the space in her own bag just to get her to shut up.
"Sir," said a young Marine, approaching them, "I am to show you to your quarters."
The Defiant was a sleek vessel, there was no denying it. As well as the familiar but disturbing scent of a starship, the air held notes of newness: fresh paint, metal vapors of solder fumes, antiseptic odors from the sanitizing sweep before she was cleared for boarding. But there was something else about her that felt strange. Talon had served aboard several military vessels, from the corvette, the Daisy, to the fleet's flagship, the Fearless. Each ship had been different, yet in some ways they were the same. The doorways had all been arched. The passageways had been identical in cross-section, a square with the edges cut off. The bulkheads had been smooth, except for the indentations for hand. "Where are the little bars for holding on to in case we lose gravity?" she asked. The Marine replied, "No need for them, ma'am." "What do you mean there's no need? We're in space. It's impossible for the Defiant to lose gravity. That can only happen if the ship disintegrates, when we'll have more problems than not knowing which way is up." "Huh?" Talon turned her puzzled expression to Wright.
"I don't understand it properly either," he said. "It's something to do with the new engineering. Gravity is part of the fabric of space within the ship. It's a part of her design."
"Right," said Talon, though she was no closer to comprehending. "What?" Kayla asked, outraged. "You mean I did all that zero-gravity training for nothing? I threw up 1,000,000 times." The Marine grinned. "Sorry about that, miss. You might be interested to hear another aspect of the Defiant's design. She's partly organic." "Organic? You mean flesh and blood?" "Living material helps her move through the skein." He gave an embarrassed grin. "I don't claim to know exactly what that means. That's just what the scientists and engineers say. All of this is top secret, of course. That's why you couldn't know these things until you came aboard." "Then how come you're telling us now?" When the young man didn't answer, Talon said, "Because by the time we get back, it won't be." "Oh," Kayla said, her expression troubled. Was she only just beginning to understand that years would pass on Earth while they were gone? The fact had been made plain to her several times over the last few months, but she was barely a teenager. Her mind was on many things, but physics wasn't one of them. For her, the here and now were all that was important, and she probably didn't think about much else. The uncomfortable realization was quickly forgotten when Kayla saw her cabin. Space was tight on the starship, but in recognition of their non-military and minor status, she and Patron had been given singles. Talon and Wright shared a double between them. She left the kids to settle into their new homes while she and Wright unpacked. The orderliness with which he folded and stored his possessions was mildly disturbing, but military life was all he'd known since he was 18. She guessed some things about him would never change. She stowed her few belongings. Next came yet another briefing, this time in the vessel's small auditorium. "Surely they've told us everything there is to know?" she asked as they took seats.
"Like the Marines said," Wright replied, "we're aboard ship now. We can't com Earth, so we're effectively cut off from everyone except our shipmates. This is where we hear the stuff they couldn't or didn't want to tell us before."
They were among the last to arrive. As soon as they were seated, a short man in a Royal Navy uniform walked to the front of the room. "Who's that?" Talon whispered. "He looks familiar." After a quiet sigh that told her she should already know the answer to her question, Wright replied,
"Admiral of the fleet, Yorkson."
"Was he the one on the Fearless that Merlin brought back to his senses?"
"That's right. I'm surprised it's him, not Lieutenant General Carroll, leading the mission. We have to be quiet now."
The Admiral seemed about to speak, but conversational buzz in the room continued. He frowned. He probably wasn't used to addressing civilians who wouldn't give him his accustomed deference and instant obedience. It took him loudly clearing his throat to make everyone pipe down. "Ladies and gentlemen, officers and Marines, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you aboard the Defiant. While many of you are under orders and therefore have no choice about being here, a significant proportion of you are not. You have chosen to join this mission and leave behind your lives on Earth of your own free will, and for that you have my and the BI government's gratitude. However, you must understand this is a military endeavor, and as such, military standard behavior is expected of everyone." While Yorkson was whittering on, Talon peered around the assembled heads. Where was Arthur? Carla Orr and her horrible son seemed to be absent too. Then she saw a face she recognized and gave a gasp of delight. A Batcher!
"Now you're here," said Yorkson, "I can pass on more information that's recently come to our notice. As you're aware, the purpose of this mission is to address the threat a hostile alien species poses to human autonomy. These creatures have interfered in the course of human history, turning our political conflicts into games for their own sport. This cannot be tolerated, and so we must find them and challenge them. We must demand and insist they leave us alone, under the threat of an armed response if necessary. Admittedly, the Defiant is David compared to our enemy's Goliath, but we must do what we can with the resources we have to hand. You all know about the patterns identified in our new understanding of the universe that indicate we may be on the right path." He inhaled deeply before saying, "We have also recently learned our mission is more urgent and important than ever. The Skein mappers have identified signs that aliens have returned to Earth." Raising his voice over the murmurs of dismay and amazement his statement provoked, Yorkson continued, "The mappers haven't managed to narrow down the disturbance in the pattern to individuals yet. That may be something they are able to do during our absence. If they do, measures will be taken to eliminate the entities concerned." Talon's ears had pricked up. Finally, the Admiral was saying something interesting. So Merlin and Morgan had come back? Or maybe different members of their species had decided to play their game. She recalled the visit to the Institute for Skein Studies and the complex web of connections joining the hundreds of people in the room. She couldn't imagine how complex a similar map of the globe might be, or how the mappers might have discovered the new interference. Then a realization hit. She turned to Wright. "You knew all about this, didn't you? That's what your secret conference with Colburn was about." He gave an apologetic smile. "Wait," said Melier, rising to his feet. "No one gave us this information before we signed up. If we'd known, some of us might not have agreed to come along. Everyone here has left behind family and loved ones who might be in danger. Unfortunately, the information has only just come to light," Yorkson replied. It arrived too late to alter any of the mission parameters, personnel included.
The Admiral stared at Malia in silence until the West BI native sat down. The former resistance leader looked seriously pissed off, and his brothers would follow his lead. There could be trouble ahead. Chapter 12. They lied, Talon muttered, digging into the BA's version of scrambled eggs. The Alliance has known the aliens are back for months. They bloody lied, and I'm damned if I'm keeping my mouth shut about it. Wright sighed and pinched the top of his nose between forefinger and thumb.
Please don't say anything. We're here now. There's no going back. Anything you tell your friends from West BI will only cause problems.
They're not my friends. Most of them hate me, except Mark. But they're brave and loyal men, and they don't deserve to be lied to. She threw down her fork in disgust. It bounced and landed on the deck with a clatter. The noise drew attention in the refectory. When Talon didn't move to pick it up, Wright stooped and scooped up the cutlery, placing it on the table as if the whole thing was an accident, not a display of Talon's temper. The diners returned to eating while Wright's new wife quietly seethed. She'd been uncommunicative since the meeting yesterday. He didn't think he'd ever seen her this angry, except maybe the night she'd kicked him out. She narrowed her eyes at him.
You lied too. No, I didn't, he replied patiently. I couldn't tell you what I knew. You aren't a Royal Marine anymore, and even if you were, your rank wouldn't have given you clearance.
So you lied by omission. It's still a lie.
What do you expect me to do? This is my job. I have rules I have to follow.
Almost before the words were out of his mouth, he realized he'd said completely the wrong thing. So you put your job before our relationship? Before me? Her expression had changed, her anger replaced by hurt. You knew something that could influence my decision about joining the mission, and you chose not to tell me. Your work is more important than you to openness and honesty with your spouse. Strictly speaking, she hadn't been his spouse at the time, but a belated sense of judgment told him this wasn't the moment to make the point.
I'm sorry, but my hands were tied, and I thought, in the circumstances, the best thing for you, Patron and Kayla, would be to come on the mission. The signs in the Skein indicated it was the right course of action. Who knows what'll go down on Earth now the aliens are back? You and your children could have been targeted.
That's why you wanted us to get married? So I would come with you? Tears glimmered in her eyes. Wright silently cursed. Talon was a strong woman, probably the strongest he'd ever met, in all senses of the word, yet he seemed to regularly reduce her to an emotional wreck. He reached over the table and covered her hand with his.
I love you, with all my heart and forever. That's why I wanted us to get married.
She didn't look convinced. Pushing her plate away, she stood up and walked off.
Hey, Talon,
said a voice at Wright's side. She must have heard, but she didn't turn around.
Abacha,
said Wright.
Great to see you. Take a seat.
What's up with her? Asked the corporal.
It's nothing personal. She's looking forward to catching up with you. She just has a lot on her mind.
Talon suddenly reappeared and gave Abacha a hug.
Everything okay, little chick? He asked.
Everything's just fine. Talon threw Wright a dirty look before stalking away again.
Always was a pain in the ass, Abacha said. What's got her goat this time? I thought she'd be okay now she got her kids back. We have a difference of opinion. That's all. About something important. Shame. I was going to congratulate you guys on getting married, but I guess not. Maybe save it for later. Planning on starting up another Shang-Chi tournament?
Abacha grinned.
You read my mind. Count me in, though I expect I won't make it through the first round as usual. Don't put yourself down. I bet you'll make round 2 at least.
He glanced around the refectory with a predatory look.
Plenty of newbies in here. You'll have an advantage. I'll need it.
Wright looked down at his bagel, his appetite gone. Then he remembered something that brightened his mood.
While you're here, I have some good news. Do you miss our time on the Resolute?
I do.
It was fun, right? Aside from nearly dying in the Australian bush, I mean.
Wright chuckled.
Yeah, aside from that. You know we're picking up a few more personnel on Mars. Well, 2 of them are Ford and Kroll.
You're kidding. That's great news.
They're both part of this too, somehow.
Abacha's face fell.
Kroll got pretty good at Shang-Chi on that deployment, so you'll have a worthy opponent, someone to really test your abilities.
Yeah. He frowned.
I'll need to up my game, but you're right, it'll be good for me. I'll ask the purser if I can print some medals. I'd better have extra for the runners-up. I only hope I'm not one of them. Kroll will never let me live it down. If it gets her talking, who cares? I care. I care, man. Oops, sorry, I mean, sir.
Wright waved dismissively.
Don't worry about it. Just watch out if Colburn's around. Do you know how long it'll take us to reach Mars? I'm wondering if I should announce the tournament now or wait for the main voyage. Only 2 days, and that's travelling at nowhere near top speed.
Abacha whistled.
2 days to Mars. Who would have thought it, even a few years ago?
By the time the Defiant settled into Mars orbit, Talon had started speaking to Wright again, but her attitude remained cool. He didn't know what to say or do to make things better between them. He couldn't change the facts. He wasn't allowed to reveal sensitive information to people who didn't have the clearance to hear it, not even his wife. And he had known Earth was under imminent threat when he proposed. He had wanted to get Talon and her kids away. He couldn't deny any of it. Then he thought of something that might convince her about his true feelings. He didn't see her all day until the official ceremony to welcome the remaining mission members boarding from Mars. Only military personnel were required to attend. Civilian participation was optional, but Talon was here anyway. She hadn't mentioned she'd been planning to come. He hoped she was only curious to see who was coming aboard, not using the opportunity to demand a sudden exit. He wouldn't put it past her. She had never been the best at following orders. But Patron and Kayla weren't here, and Talon would never abandon them. Yorkson was dressed in full regalia, looking pompous and self-satisfied. It seemed a necessary characteristic of officers of the highest rank, or maybe rising in the ranks made you that way. The rest of the military complement of the Defiant's crew had lined up along one side of the passageway. The few civilians stood in a less straight line opposite. Mars Station was an Alliance outpost, hence the formality. Yorkson had even arranged for the newcomers to be piped aboard. The whistle sounded as the first arrivals emerged from the airlock. There was Lieutenant Ford, now Captain Ford. The Australian sun had aged him. Wright allowed himself a flicker of a smile as they saluted and made eye contact. And there was Kroll, her dour features betraying no sign of recognition. Never mind. She'd never been the most expressive person in the world. Was she up to speed with a new model of starship engine? He didn't doubt it. She had probably been practicing Shang-Chi in the intervening years too. Another figure appeared, and Wright's heart warmed. Iolani Hale had been working on the terraforming of Earth's sister planet, but now, as he understood, she would be responsible for the Defiant's green habitat. Heck, the ship probably only had a habitat due to her report on the voyage of the Dauntless. Had other measures been taken to mitigate the psychological effects of a deep space journey? The last thing they needed was a repeat of the events on that trip, when several people had died and Iolani had nearly joined them. All the newcomers had arrived. The airlock hatch closed and the 2 lines of greeters began to dissolve. The assigned Marine took Ford and Kroll to their quarters. Wright approached Iolani for a less formal hello, but Talon reached her first. The two women began to chat, and he hesitated. "Major Wright," Iolani called out as she noticed him. "There you are. I knew you were here, but I couldn't spot you. You guys all look the same in uniform." "He's a lieutenant colonel now," Talon corrected. "You got promoted. Congratulations." "And we got married." Wright lifted his eyebrows. What was going on? Was Talon claiming her territory? "Whoa, that's amazing," said Iolani. "I'm so happy for you." She hugged Talon and then Wright. "You make a great couple. Listen, can I catch up with you two later? It's been a long day and I'm bushed. I'd like to get to my cabin and settle in. Try to make the place home. It's going to be a long voyage." "Of course," Talon said. "Maybe we can meet up for dinner." Iolani left and they were alone in the passageway. The sociable mask Talon had been wearing dropped and her glum look of the last couple of days returned. Wright decided not to ask her why she'd made a point of telling Iolani they were married. Nothing good could come of it, and if she had guessed feelings might have developed between him and the scientist during the Dauntless's voyage, that wasn't unreasonable. Iolani had seemed to begin to see him as something more than a friend at one point.
"Talon, going back to our conversation at breakfast the other day."
"Yeah," she replied noncommittally, not making eye contact.
"I thought of something you might want to think about."
"What?" At least she was prepared to be persuaded. He took her left hand and lifted it, his fingers holding the two rings she always wore, an engagement and a wedding ring.
"If you remember, I proposed to you the same day we went to the Institute, and Colburn told me the Skein mappers had spotted the aliens' return. We went straight home afterward, and then out for our walk, right? I didn't have time to go and buy a ring, and I didn't need to, because I'd bought it days before. I had it with me all the time. I didn't propose to you because of what I'd just learned."
Her shoulders rose and fell. "You're right, I remember."
"You believe me?"
She finally met his gaze. "I believe you."
"So things are okay now between us?"
"Yes."
"You don't seem very happy about it."
"Now I have to worry even more about losing you." Chapter 13. The cutting-edge tech upgrades and final checks for the Defiant would take around 10 days. To help pass the time, Iolani had offered to take Talon, Wright, Patron and Kayla on a Mars station tour. She'd been working as a consultant on the terraforming of the planet since returning from the voyage of the Dauntless. "It isn't going well," she said ruefully as the shuttle took them down to the surface. "Krakoa has done her best, but there's so much we still don't know." She was referring to the 6th member of their party. Talon hadn't noticed her in particular when she'd boarded the Defiant yesterday. Krakoa was apparently another mission member identified by the Skein mappers for her place in the pattern. "It's been one headache after another right from the start," she echoed. Like Iolani, Krakoa was small, dark-haired and olive-skinned. "The Alliance asked me to oversee the terraforming due to my work experience on the Brez, but creating ecosystems on a planet is a whole other ballgame, as I soon found out. I was Director of Habitats on the Antarctic project. It was how Iolani and I met. When Lorcan decided to strip all 3 ships down to bare bones and start again, I was out of a job. He offered to pay a retainer until he needed me again, but I would have been bored out of my mind with nothing to do. So I jumped at the Alliance's offer. Took me about 6 months to realize I'd made a mistake. Since then, I think it's only my own sheer pig-headedness that's kept me going." "You did a great job in the circumstances," said Iolani, squeezing Krakoa's hand. They shared a look that told Talon she hadn't needed to have any concerns about Iolani and Wright's friendship. "Attempts to terraform Mars have been going on for more than a millennium," Iolani continued. The work you did means we're closer now than ever. Maybe, Kekoa answered. I'm looking forward to seeing how things progress while we're gone. It's kind of handy to have the opportunity to jump forward a few years. The processes are so slow and Mars is so big. It's like trying to watch evolution in action. How many years will we be gone, I wonder, said Iolani. That was the big question. For the journey of the Dauntless, it had been easy for astrophysicists to compute exactly how much time would pass on Earth while the ship travelled through interstellar space. The calculation for the Defiant's voyage was not so clear-cut. It was why Talon had never even contemplated leaving Patron and Kayla behind and undertaking the mission without them. Aside from the fact they were too young to be left without a parent, there was no way she was going to miss out on years of their lives, perhaps all the life they had. You were both so lucky working for Uncle Lorcan, Kayla said. He's lovely. Iolani, who had been taking a sip of coffee, spat out her drink all over herself and commenced a fit of coughing. Kekoa patted her back while also dabbing at her clothes with napkins while quietly chuckling for some reason. Sorry, Iolani croaked. Went down the wrong way. Ma'am, said Kayla, will we see Arthur while we're down there? Talon suspected she'd grown a little jealous of the attention Patron had received from the king on their horse-riding excursions. I don't think so, sweetheart. He's on an official visit. All his time will be taken up with meetings and social events. You should have plenty more opportunities to see him after we set off, Wright said. He'll have lots of free time. Everyone's schedule will become much less hectic. Yes, said Iolani, turning in her seat to face Kayla. It'll be hard to find stuff to do to keep ourselves occupied. You'll have lots of chances to spend time with Arthur. Kekoa laughed and shook her head. Listen to you guys, on first-name terms with the King of the Britannic Isles. Talon said, So will you be before long. He's very approachable. That's the impression I have, Kekoa replied, which is why it makes even less sense he's married to that she-devil Dwyer. It's a marriage of convenience, right? Has to be. You didn't hear it from me, Wright joked. Is the Dwyer taking part in the ceremonies? Asked Patron. Wright snorted his disgust. Yeah, she'll be there. She won't miss an opportunity to show off. Her slimy son is with her too. Exiting the shuttle, Talon hoped her and Arthur's paths might cross on Mars, even though it was unlikely. She hadn't seen him aboard the Defiant yet. She wasn't sure why, but he, Orr, and Orr's son hadn't mingled with the rest of the passengers at all, as far as she knew. The Alliance couldn't keep the BI's royalty separate from everyone else forever, or at least not the king. Orr and little Orr could spend their entire voyage in the brig as far as she was concerned. Beyond the shuttle landing pad, red Martian dust covered the ground between concrete pathways and more landing pads. The dust lay in a fine layer on everything else and tinged the sky pink-orange. She hadn't seen Arthur much at all since his return to Earth, and she missed him. It was odd. There had been a time she had feared him and been appalled by his behaviour, but now she didn't think it was his true nature, more what he felt compelled to do. Realising everything he'd done was due to Merlin and Morgan's manipulations must have been devastating. Evasuits were still required for getting about on Mars. A spaceport official made the party wait at the base of the ramp while he checked their suits' stats. Talon brought up the environment levels on her visor overlay. Oxygen sat at 5.5%. CO2 still comprised most of the planet's atmosphere. Terraforming definitely wasn't going well. Okay, said the official via comm. You're all fine and cleared to go. Follow the red arrows to immigration. I feel so much lighter, Kayla exclaimed. This is cool. She jumped, rising far off the ground before descending. Talon said, Can you save the acrobatics until we're outside the spaceport? I'm surprised this isn't all enclosed, Wright remarked as they walked along. Most Martian bases are enclosed, said Cocoa. Almost everything is underground. Only the spaceports are above ground for the shuttle landings. Bases? Kayla asked. Don't you mean towns? No. There are no towns here. Just research bases and mine sites. Though I suppose you could call the miners' residences towns of a kind. They've expanded a lot since Lorcan shifted all his operations off Earth. But I thought we were colonizing Mars, said Kayla. What would be the point of that? Asked Patron. Even the most inhospitable places on Earth are way easier for humans to survive in than anywhere on Mars. Your brother's right, said Iolani. People used to talk about Mars colonization programs hundreds of years ago, but no one's thought it's a good idea for a long time. There are too many disadvantages to make it worthwhile. Like what? Kayla took a leap and sailed upward. I'd love it. You wouldn't like the effects of low gravity on your bones, said Cocoa. To avoid long-term damage, I had to spend at least half my days here in a chamber that created Earth-equivalent gravity. And then there's the radiation. Unless we somehow manage to kickstart a magnetosphere, it isn't going away anytime soon. Martians will have to live underground or in radiation-proof habitations, rarely going outside. And when they do go outside, in most places it's too cold to take off EVA suits. Would you like that? Maybe not. Just some of the problems we face with terraforming, Cocoa said to the group generally. Very few organisms survive here, only a handful of species that metabolize CO2 and hydrogen. The radiation, cold, or low atmospheric pressure kills almost everything else eventually. After passing the immigration checks, Cocoa requested a transport to take them to Valles Marineris Minor. As the vehicle took them down a tunnel, Cocoa explained that the underground road and rail network covered most of the vast valley. It was built in more optimistic times. The minimal activity in the crust has kept it stable all these years. Lights flashed past as the vehicle sped along. Patron asked, "Do the tunnels have atmosphere?" "No," Cocoa replied. "They're way too leaky. You can only take off your suit inside a base, and then you must always check the readings on your visor beforehand. Even so, there have been accidents. Everyone here always sleeps with a suit under their bed, just in case." "It sounds worse and worse," Kayla exclaimed. "Are you happy you aren't staying now?" asked Wright. She folded her arms and didn't answer. They didn't stay long at Cocoa's now former home. The labs and living quarters were the same as you might expect to see on Earth, only perhaps barer and smellier. The place had a forgotten air about it. Talon was reminded of the preserved bases of the old explorers on Earth, their diaries, equipment and rations frozen in time. Soon they were above ground again, Cocoa driving them in a transparent roofed buggy over the rocky Martian landscape. "It's a little bit rougher than the underground network," she apologized. "There are well-worn tracks, but no paved roads on the surface." "You know, things might improve quickly here while we're gone," Talon commented. "It looks like the new tech hasn't hit Mars yet. Once it does, it'll be a game changer." "Maybe," replied Cocoa. "No doubt the little red planet will be an afterthought as usual." Looking at the surroundings, it was hard to imagine much terraforming had gone on here. The place seemed about as barren as it could get. Lifeless deserts stretched to the horizon on every side. The Australian outback was abundant in comparison. But then Talon spotted shapes that diverged from the norm up ahead. "What's that?" "Ah," Cocoa replied, smiling. "You've spotted my pride and joy." As they neared the rounded outline standing out against the pink sky, their colour intensified. On Earth it would have looked pale and wan. Here the soft green seemed remarkable, almost alien. The results of Cocoa's years of work stood about 3 meters high at their tallest. Clumps of smaller examples of the plant, fungus, had sprouted around the largest specimens. They climbed out of the buggy and approached the life growing miraculously in a highly inhospitable environment. 40 or 50 specimens dotted the ground in an area spanning 20 or so meters. Touching the tallest one proudly, Cocoa said, "I realized trying to get Earth species to grow on Mars was just about pointless. They all evolved to survive on another planet, and while succeeding generations would adapt to the conditions, natural selection has been slow so far. Even the first species we seeded Mars with centuries ago are still only clinging on. So I decided to go a different route and genetically engineered completely new organisms from the basics up. Living here meant I could test them on a daily basis, tweaking and improving as I went along." "You did a fantastic job," said Iolani. "They're amazing." Amazing was a strong word for the nondescript lumps poking up from the dry, frozen Martian soil. Talon struggled for something genuinely positive to say. "That's it," Kayla whispered. Unfortunately, because she was speaking via comm, everyone heard her. Patron said, "Kayla, how many times have you been told to watch what you A brilliant flash lit up the sky from horizon to horizon, and a dull rumble resounded underfoot. Chapter 14. Shock silenced the little group, and then Kayla said, "I'm guessing that wasn't supposed to happen." "No," said Cocoa. "We sometimes feel detonations from mining operations, but nothing like that. Something's gone very wrong. I hope no one's hurt." "Right," came Colburn's comm.
"Yes, ma'am."
"Get over to Vallis Marineris Major immediately. There's been an attack on Arthur and Orr."
"Wilco, where are they exactly?"
"Just get moving. I'll send precise coordinates as soon as I have them." She cut the comm. The Brigadier knew he was on the surface, but she didn't know who he was with. None of the others carried military implants. He hesitated.
"I have orders to drive to Vallis Marineris Major. Can you all return by yourselves to—"
"Not a chance," said Cocoa. "It's a 3-hour walk. We'd be pushing our suits O2 supplies." "What's going on?" asked Talon.
"Then you'll all have to come with me. I'll explain on the way."
They bundled into the buggy. Colburn drip-fed Wright details on the attack as he guided the vehicle over the rocky ground. The royal pair had been visiting the main research base when as yet unidentified assailants had ambushed them and their entourage in a particularly inaccessible section. The commander of the base's small military contingent had been killed in the initial assault, and his second-in-command had only just arrived on Mars. Wright considered the fact that he had only been on Mars less than a couple of hours, but clearly Colburn wanted him to take control of the situation, probably due to his history with Arthur and Orr. "But why would anyone want to assassinate Arthur and the Dwyer?" Kayla asked. "It doesn't make any sense." "People do all kinds of things for crazy reasons," Iolani replied, "and sometimes for no reason at all. Humans are dumb like that." Her comment gave Wright an idea about what might be happening at VM Major, but he kept it to himself. "Kids," Talon said, "when we get there, I want both of you to stay in this vehicle with Iolani and Cocoa." "Aren't you staying with us?" asked Kayla. "I'm going to help Wright."
"No," he objected. "Talon,
You'll need everyone you can get, and I know what I'm doing." He couldn't deny the truth of her words.
"I want to come too," said Patron. "I want to help Arthur."
Talon said, "That's brave of you, son, but I can't allow it. It's too dangerous." "Your mother's right," said Iolani. "Stay here with us."
"But I've done my training,"
Patron protested. "Training and fighting are two different things," Talon said. "This isn't a discussion. I'm telling you, you're staying here." He frowned angrily but didn't argue. The cause of the flash in the sky became apparent a kilometre from their destination. A gigantic hole had been blown open in the landscape. Debris had been scattered far and wide, and a thick pale red haze hung in the thin Martian air.
"Shit,"
Wright muttered, manoeuvring the buggy around the shattered remains of a large boulder. Kakoa sucked in a shocked breath. The section will have lost atmosphere.
"What happens in a depressurization event?"
Wright asked. After a 10-second warning, the doors nearest the breach will seal. If you don't make it through them in time, you have to put on an EVA suit and reach a pressurized area from the outside.
So there are suits stored in every section?
Usually there would be at least one for every person who regularly works in the area. But if a large group was moving through when the explosion occurred, she didn't need to go on. Whoever planned the attack would have made sure they had suits to survive the after effects, but those under attack were not so lucky. There could be people dead of asphyxiation already. "Look out!" yelled Talon. Wright avoided the obstacle just in time. "What was it?" Kayla asked, rising from her seat and craning to look. "Sit down," Talon ordered, "and face forward." The object Wright had nearly driven over was the corpse of a young woman, a scientist judging from her lab coat, her body broken. She must have been at the epicenter of the blast. Wright had only caught a glimpse of her before hearing Talon's warning, but the snapshot image burned in his mind. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he fought off the spectre of Patel's ruined face threatening from the corners of his vision.
"Where's the nearest tunnel entrance to this section?"
he asked Kakoa, frustrated that Colburn hadn't yet relayed the information. About a click that way," she replied, pointing northeast. That was why the Brigadier had only given him the detonation coordinates. Trying to reach the area via underground roads would take too much time. He would have to go in through the hole. He asked Colburn to patch him into the comm network of the Marines on site. It had already been 13 minutes since the explosion.
"Lieutenant Lethen, SITREP.
Still trying to locate King Arthur, Dwyer Orr, and her son, sir. Needless to say, they aren't answering comms. We have many dead and injured. I have 15 operational personnel, 10 more en route. I've assigned fire teams to find survivors and move them to a safe location, while the rest of us go after the king and the Dwyer."
"Any word from the attackers?"
"Nothing, sir."
"Do you know who they are?"
he asked, as he and Talon exited the buggy. "I don't know who would do such a thing. The bomb blew out a huge area just after the inspection party passed through. It's carnage down here." Her voice wobbled as she came to the end of her sentence.
"All right, Lieutenant. Keep it together. I'll be there in 2 minutes. I'll need your guidance on where to get in."
"That won't be hard, sir. The place is open to the sky nearly everywhere." She wasn't exaggerating. As he approached the hole in the ground, a huge area of the underground complex became visible. The bomb had collapsed walls at the epicenter. Farther away, furniture had been blasted apart and burned. Though the bodies of those who hadn't reached an EVA suit in time could be seen here and there, at least the loss of atmosphere had dampened fires. Otherwise, the entire place could have been incinerated. "We'd better climb in over there," said Talon, "where the ground looks most stable." He made visual contact with Lieutenant Lethen. She waved back, and when he indicated where he would try to gain access to the site, she commed, "That's as good a place as any, sir. I'll meet you there." A crumbling cliff face of Martian subsoil and rock, broken concrete and twisted rebar confronted them at the spot Talon had proposed. His civilian visor overlay didn't display distances as a HUD would, but he estimated the drop to be 12 meters. They could try to climb down the treacherous surface, risking it collapsing and trapping them under the rubble, or they could jump. "What do you think?" Talon asked.
"We're at less than half gravity. I'll aim for that bit of clear ground. If I break something, you try a different way."
"No, you're more important than me." Before he could stop her, she leapt into the chasm. The slower passage of her body moving in 0.4 G looked odd. She landed and rolled, the breathy noise of her impact sounding over her comm. Standing, she briefly shook her legs and arms and then gave him a thumbs up. In another couple of seconds he was beside her, inside the demolished remains of the section of VM Major. "Boy, am I glad to see you two," said Lethan, jogging toward them. "Remember where you are, Lieutenant," Wright barked. He couldn't afford to have her drop the ball now a superior officer had arrived. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir." "You seem to have the situation under control here. Where were Arthur and all last seen before the bomb went off?" "I'll take you there. The area is choked with debris. We're trying to clear it, but it's slow work. We don't have machinery to do the heavy lifting." "I imagine that was the hostiles' intention," said Wright. "They waited until their targets were out of serious danger before setting off the bomb, anticipating the damage would hamper pursuit." "Talon?" It was Krakoa. His comm remained open to the civilian channel he'd been using with her and the others. "Yes?" Talon responded. "What is it?" "I'm really sorry, but Patron and Kayla got away." "What?" "They've left the vehicle. They must have some kind of secret signal system. They jumped out together and ran off. There was nothing Iolani or I could do to stop them. I think they're planning on helping you guys." Wright thought the same, though the idiot children only added to his problems. "Tell them, I know, I'm on it." She sounded as irritated as he felt. "Lead the way, Lieutenant." Chapter 15. Marines moved slowly among the rubble at the caved-in entrance to a passageway, carrying lumps of concrete and levering others from the piles. They were at a far side of the destroyed section, under a jagged-edged roof. Deep cracks ran at all angles across the ceiling, forewarning of imminent collapse. "What a nightmare," said Wright on a one-to-one channel with Talon. She'd kept him out of her comms with her kids. He could just imagine the lashing they were receiving. "You two," he said, addressing a pair of Marines pulling a body out from a recently excavated mound. "Leave that. Look for beams, posts, and anything you can find to prop up this ceiling. Lethan, get all your people working in here. I want access to that tunnel, and I need 2 pulse rifles, beamers, and knives." "Yes, sir." "What's happening in the section ahead? How much of the area has depressurized?" "Don't know, sir. The main system hasn't received any readings from the sensors there since the blast. In theory, a door about 50 meters down the passageway should have sealed." "Should there be people beyond it?" "Yes, but not many. It's a storage section, a warehouse. A road runs to it direct from the spaceport." As soon as a narrow space at the top of the blocked tunnel was cleared, Talon climbed up and peered in, the blackness beyond dissolving as her helmet light activated. "Looks pretty empty on this side." Whoever had placed the bomb had done an excellent job. This was not the work of amateurs or opportunists. The attack had been carefully planned and carried out. Without another word, Talon disappeared into the gap. Damn it! He scrambled up after her, telling Lethan to continue clearing the space, then sending a team to rendezvous with him on the other side. "Talon, hold on," he said, as he reached the narrow void. "Patron and Kayla are in here. They've turned off their comms, but Krakoa just told me she spotted them running into the tunnel entrance." "Huh?" He dropped the weapons Lethan had given him through the hole and then eased himself into it, feet first. "She said that was a kilometer away." "And this is Martian gravity." Great. Now they had to rescue 2 errant children, as well as Arthur, Orr, and her son. His body dangled, his shoulders caught on the jagged opening. After some twisting and turning as the rocky surface grated against his suit, he dropped to the ground and picked up the weapons. Talon had jogged ahead while he'd been making his way in. He asked her to wait, and for once she complied. "Our visors have night vision," he said, when he caught up to her. He handed her a rifle, beamer, and knife. "Turn off your helmet light." The bright beam would be a clear signal to the kidnappers. "Where am I supposed to put these?" she asked. She'd slung the rifle over her shoulder, but their Eva suits had nowhere to stow the other weapons.
"Just hold them."
He muttered a curse. They were not well prepared for facing armed hostiles. Their suits weren't even armoured. They set off. In the time it had taken them to reach the explosion site, plus the additional minutes spent arriving in the passageway, the attackers could have moved far. Perhaps they could even have reached an escape vehicle, but they would have been seen leaving. After passing one empty room, some kind of office, they hit closed double doors across the passage. This had to be the warehouse entrance Lethan had mentioned. As she'd predicted, the doors were sealed.
"Lethan,"
Wright conned. "Yes, sir."
"Is there a security override code for this area?"
He prayed he didn't need an official's biosignatures. "Yes, sir, but you can't input it. I know where you are. I can open that seal remotely, but the section beyond it will depressurize."
"Do it."
He turned to Talon.
"We have to move back."
There was no shelter. Before they'd gone a few meters, the doors whipped open, air flooded out, and debris began to fly down the passage. Mars wasn't a vacuum, but its atmosphere remained much thinner than Earth's. The evening up of the pressure difference moved surprisingly large items. A desk dragged past, a chair caught underneath it. Sir," said Lethan, "we've opened up the gap you went through, and I'm sending Marines through to back you up, but all this stuff flying down here is going to hamper them."
"It can't be helped. Do what you can."
"Won't Arthur die if we don't reach him quickly now?" Talon asked. "What if the attackers don't give him a suit?"
"I'm not sure what'll happen. I saw him survive a complete vacuum once."
That had been on the Dauntless, when the Merlins and Morgans had attacked. He wasn't sure if the protection the king had enjoyed then still applied. Talon hadn't mentioned ore, but the Dwyer had seemed sure she would also survive deep space. Whether her son possessed the same ability was another question. Nevertheless, they couldn't waste any more time.
"Let's go."
Pushing against the escaping air and avoiding the occasional flying object, they returned down the passageway. No lights lit the warehouse interior, not even emergency lighting. Someone had darkened the place. His night vision revealed wide shelves rising on each side to the high ceiling, their contents slowly sliding off.
"Watch out!"
He pushed Talon out of the way just in time as a box plummeted to the ground and split, scattering metal parts.
"We should stay in the center of the aisles,"
he said. "We need cover." She was right. It was a toss-up between being hit by falling packaged goods or being shot at. They moved to the edge and continued walking slowly forward, casting frequent upward glances. The escape of the atmosphere appeared to be slowing down. "At least Patron and Kayla can't be in here," said Talon. "They wouldn't have been able to get in." "Sir," said Lethan via comm, "I've just received notification the outer airlock was opened from the inside." "What the hell?" He gave Talon the bad news and winced at the barrage of foul language she issued. "How on earth did they get in?" she finally asked.
"It might not be the kids,"
he replied.
"It could be the attackers leaving."
It was not the attackers leaving, at least not the ones who had kidnapped the royal party.
"I demand to be returned to my rightful position."
Or had stepped in front of them. Though she wore an Eva suit, her bearing made her unmistakable. The also-suited figure flanking her on her right seemed to be her son. Another man stood assertively to her left. Wright halted.
"Where's Arthur?"
he asked via external comm, casting the weapons in his hands aside and lifting his rifle to his shoulder. He expected Talon to do the same, but she'd vanished.
"He's choking out the remainder of his life not far from here," Orr replied. "If the Alliance wants him to live, they must return me and my son to Earth and restore all our rights. I will hold Arthur hostage until my demands are met. He doesn't need to be there. That was my guess too, but I was wrong, and so are you. Then you'll need to give him a suit or you'll be killing your only bargaining chip. Don't worry, my loyal crusaders are seeing to it. Finding one to fit him proved somewhat of a challenge."
The tightness in Wright's chest eased. Arthur wasn't about to die.
"You're insane, Orr, if you think you'll get off an Alliance outpost alive. Our military has this place surrounded." "Your confidence is misguided, Wright. My people have infiltrated every sector of Mars Station. I have miners, technicians, cleaners, even scientists here. You never know. Perhaps some of your military are also secretly devoted to me, and you dare not kill me. Not yet. Not while we're so close to Earth. The BA still needs the compliance of Crusaders."
He wasn't so sure she was correct. The Alliance was allowing her to live because of her significance in the Skein. A few fundamentalist fanatics remained, but politically the EAC was dead.
"My communication will have reached the BI government by now," said Orr. "Neither I nor it has any further need of you."
Her head turned to the man at her side as if she was issuing him a command. Before he could follow it, Wright ducked behind some shelving, slung his rifle over his back, and ran. Where was Talon? He didn't want to risk comming her. Without encryption, Orr's followers at the station might be able to tap into their conversation. The metal units on each side of him whipped past. He reached the end of the row and checked from side to side. Nothing but shelves and the scattered contents they had once held. A burst of light and a fierce hiss erupted next to his head. He was being fired at. He darted into the space and ran several rows down before darting into one. Talon had to be searching for Arthur, or perhaps her kids. Where were they, and how had they managed to get in? Orr hadn't mentioned a word about them. Stores packed the shelves here, clearly items too heavy to be dragged off when the place depressurized. He arrived at a wall, hoping for an opening but meeting a dead end. He would have to go back. Or would he? His gaze travelled up the shelving. It seemed to stop before it reached the ceiling, leaving a gap. He had no time to figure out for sure. He climbed onto the lowest tier and stretched to reach the one above. His fingertips grasped the edge. He hauled himself up, pushing over an elbow and then a knee. Running footsteps sounded nearby, faint in the thin air. Quickly sliding into a recess between two boxes, he held his breath and waited. The footsteps stopped. A beat passed, and then they started up again. Wright climbed the rest of the way to the top. A steel and cardboard landscape spread out all around, the ceiling roughly a couple of meters above. He spotted movement. Like a bird on a perch, a figure squatted on a shelf some distance away, waving. Talon. She pointed downward. She had found Arthur. Chapter 16. Thin struts linked each set of shelving. There was no other way of travelling between them without descending to the floor. Talon had been smart to take this other route around the warehouse. It would be a while before Orr's goons thought to look above their heads, but she was better suited than him for balancing on the connecting strips. If he fell, he probably wouldn't break anything due to the low gravity, but the noise would give him away immediately, and as Orr had pointed out, she had no reason to spare his life. He crawled to the aisle end of the shelving, where a strut branched out to the next set. From his high vantage point, more of Orr's crusaders were visible, walking along the aisles, searching for him. Two women who had presumably been faithful to the Alliance sprawled out, lifeless, their torsos marked with pulse rounds. The strut was about as wide as his palm. He could try to walk it like a tightrope, but no, he couldn't stand upright. The ceiling was too low. He would be forced to bend over, and 4 limbs were more stable than 2 anyway. He slid one hand down the strut, reaching out, before following it with his other hand. His right knee came next. Then, how to do this? Talon was gesturing at him frantically. Something was happening and she needed his help. He brought his left knee forward, but there was nowhere for it to go. He wobbled. He tried to move back, but his right knee slipped off the strut. As he fell, he managed to grab it with his hands. For a second he hung like a monkey in a tree. There he is! As he heaved himself up, a pulse round hissed past. He leapt onto the strut and ran along it, stooping. Pain exploded from his thighs. He'd been hit. Talon was up and racing toward him, raining pulses down on his attackers. He made it to the next set of shelves, but then collapsed. The sensation from his legs was agonizing. He couldn't move, and his suit was losing air. Talon was at his side. "Get me an Eva suit!" she yelled, her voice echoing despite the thin atmosphere. "Or, get me a fucking suit! If he dies, I'll come down there and kill you! You know I can do it!" His chest laboured as his lungs fought for oxygen. He was fading. The ceiling seemed to move away, and then it turned black. He came to with the feeling he'd been roughly manhandled, but he could breathe again. He inhaled deeply and opened his eyes. He was looking at the same ceiling he'd seen as he passed out. His thighs felt like they were on fire. There was Talon. "I didn't die," he said. She tilted her head, puzzled. He switched to external comm and softly repeated himself. "No, you made it," she replied, "though you're damned hard to get out of and into a suit. Or values her life very highly." Leaning out a little, she went on, louder, "Isn't that right, my dear Dweer? Not going to take even the slightest chance I might get you." A pulse round flew past and scorched the concrete above. Carla Orr's voice drifted up. "Enjoy your brief remaining moments, Taylan Ellis. You're trapped. I hold all the cards. Your weapon will run out of power eventually, and my soldiers will overwhelm you. Then you won't be a danger to me any longer." Talon leaned in close and whispered, "She thinks only Arthur and I can kill her." "She does? Another Crusader delusion." Talon shrugged. "Lucky for you, anyway." The Dweer's comments on the Dauntless began to make sense. She'd said something about drifting in space, unable to die, if he put her out the airlock. Whatever the woman was on, it was strong stuff. "Orr's got a point," Talon said. "We are trapped." "What's happened to Lethen? She should be here by now." "There was some fighting over by the door while you were out. I think we caught a break getting in when we did. The Crusaders were still recovering from the depressurization." "I only spotted a handful of them," Wright said. "How about you?" "The same. Arthur's over there." She nodded toward the corner he'd seen her at before. "I thought so." "He only has 3 Crusaders guarding him, but I couldn't get a clear shot at all of them. I was hoping you could take out 1 or 2 from another direction." "I don't think I'm in a fit state to take out anyone right now." The pain from his wounded thighs was rapidly intensifying as his adrenaline faded. If only he were armoured up, he would have the benefit of rapid effect analgesics. Doing it the old-fashioned way sucked. "I don't think I can even move. Sorry." "Don't apologise for staying alive, nitwit." "If I hadn't persuaded you to join the mission, I'd be—" "I knew you had an ulterior motive. Shut up, okay? Don't waste your energy. I need to figure this out." But what could she possibly figure out? They were surrounded by Crusaders, and an untold number also occupied roles all over the station. Orr's plan to force the Alliance to return her to Earth under threat of killing Arthur could easily succeed. The BA wanted and needed their king, if not to maintain political control on Earth, then to play his part in preventing the aliens' interference. They might give up a lot to keep him alive, including a certain lieutenant colonel and maybe even Talon. The surface he was on shook in a telltale manner. Talon clearly felt it too. She reached out with her rifle, pointed the muzzle downward, and fired. The shelving shuddered, and a thud resounded from below. "The higher ground always carries the advantage," she muttered. "That's what Dad always said." After a pause, she added, "Damn it, Right! What are we going to do?" She appeared to be reaching the same conclusion he had a moment earlier. They were screwed. Then a shriek rent the air. "Gone! What do you mean? He's gone!" Talon peeked over the edge of the shelf. "The Dweer's losing her shit. I think she doesn't have Arthur anymore. He must have got away somehow. I'm gonna—" She wanted to take advantage of Orr's distraction. "Go," he said. "I'll be fine." He pulled himself painfully up onto his elbows and lifted the rifle Talon had placed by his side. "I will. I have this. Go and do your stuff." "I wish I could kiss you." She bumped her visor against his and disappeared. Pulses hissed, momentarily whiting out his night vision with their flashes. There were shouts and the running of booted feet. An agonized scream rang out. Vague, meaningless sounds reached him. Then a hush fell. Wright strained his hearing. What was going on? Had the voice screaming been Talon's? He tried to pull himself closer to the edge of the shelf to see what was happening, but the slightest movement of his legs brought paralyzing pain. He lay down again, cursing his feebleness and impotence. What if Orr had caught Talon? What if she had killed her while he was lying here, useless? His resting place juddered. Someone was climbing up. If it was Talon, she would call out and warn him. No sound came from the climber. He angled his rifle to point at the place he guessed the person would emerge. He would get only one chance to take them out, and only then if they were stupid enough to expose themselves before firing. Staring at the spot where he anticipated his attacker would appear, he rested his finger lightly on the trigger. A head rose up. It wasn't Talon's. He fired. At the last second, he realized his mistake and managed to jerk the rifle a fraction. The shot kissed the figure's helmet before it went wide. The head ducked down. "It's Kayla! Please don't shoot!" "Stars, Kayla! I could have killed you. Are you okay?" She reappeared and nodded. "It's my fault. Ma'am told me to warn you I was coming up, but I forgot. I wanted to see if you were all right. She said you got shot. Are you okay?" "I'm all the better for not murdering you." As they'd been talking, the shelves had begun moving again. Someone else was climbing up. Another head appeared opposite Kayla's. Patron. "Thank the stars you're still alive, TJ," he said. "Hold on just another minute. Arthur's coming up to help you get down." "Arthur?" Wright asked. "He's free." "Patron and I did it," said Kayla excitedly. "It was so cool. They didn't suspect us until right at the end, did they, Patron?" "No, they didn't. Dumb crusaders." "What did you do?" "I'll tell you later," Patron replied. "I'd better help you get down quick, or Mam'll kill me." Chapter 17. The atmosphere in the cabin on the shuttle journey back to the Defiant was far different than it had been on the ride down to the surface of Mars. Kakoa and Iolani sat silently holding hands, and Talon was quiet and pensive. Wright was still in pain despite the analgesics the Martian doctor had dispensed. She had said he needed to remain conscious for his medical assessment when he arrived back on the ship. Only Patron and Kayla were bright and upbeat, swapping remarks on the events in the Crusader attack. Even Arthur, usually mild-tempered whenever he wasn't in battle, seemed morose and lost in thought. He was joining them for immediate evacuation to the ship, while Orr and her son would stay on Mars until the station director determined who among his staff was secretly a Crusader. Wright reckoned he knew what Arthur was thinking about. In the skirmish, while Talon's children had done whatever it was they did to free him, they hadn't explained yet. He'd been hit by pulse fire. Like Wright, he'd been wearing a civilian EVA suit, which was utterly useless to protect against an armed attack. Arthur had been hit in the midriff, and the doc would have only given him sufficient meds to take the edge off the pain. From the expression on his face as he lay across the seating, he was suffering just as much as Wright, but that probably wasn't the main cause of his worries. Arthur should not have been vulnerable to pulse rounds at all. In every fight ever since he'd been brought back to life, the energy bolts had slid over him, harmless as a puff of wind. Today's battle had been the first time he'd been actually hit, and Orr had said she'd needed to find him an EVA suit when the warehouse depressurized. When the Dauntless had been attacked, Arthur had survived the vacuum of space. He wasn't only aging, he was becoming more human in other ways too. He was becoming mortal.
"Hey, kids,"
Wright called out.
"Yes, TJ?"
Patron replied.
"Come here and tell me what you did in the warehouse. I still don't understand how you managed to get in."
Perhaps Arthur would be glad of the distraction too. Talon, sitting in the aisle seat in front of the king, looked up sadly. "Please don't encourage them, Wright." She had to be rueing her decision to allow her children to join the mission. Patron and Kayla were high on the excitement and triumph of their plan's success, but things could easily have gone differently. The pair ignored their mother and climbed into the seats in front of him, leaning over their backs to talk.
"As soon as I saw the explosion," said Patron, "I figured out it had to be Crusaders. They love that shit."
"Patron," Talon said, a stern note in her voice, "don't swear." Wright blinked and looked at her, wide-eyed. She stared back. "What?" His volume a notch lower, the boy continued.
"I knew Kakoa and Ailani would never allow us to leave the vehicle, but I also knew we could help you guys and Arthur a lot. None of you know Crusaders like I do."
Talon silently shook her head. "Me too," Kayla protested.
"Yeah,"
Patron conceded reluctantly.
"Honestly, sis, it was more like you would never have let me go alone."
Kayla grinned. "That's true."
"Do you two have a secret sign language?"
asked Wright, remembering Kakoa's remark. "Yes," the woman in question echoed, apparently overhearing. She leaned out into the aisle, looking back. "Do you?"
"Not really," said Patron, "but we've grown up together. We get each other, right, Kayla?"
"Yeah, I could tell from his face what he was planning." She added to Kakoa, "Sorry about running off like that." Kakoa replied, "I guess it all came out in the wash in the end."
"I thought," said Patron, "if I talked to them in the right accent, telling them we were here to help, they would let us in, and they did." "Couldn't they tell you were just kids?"
Wright asked, then immediately regretted the question as he registered Patron's offended look.
"I mean adolescents."
He wasn't sure if his correction made a difference. "Do we look like kids in our EVA suits?" asked Kayla.
"Good point."
The suit's tinted visors would have prevented the Crusaders from seeing their faces clearly, and Patron was taller and bulkier even than him. Kayla was a fair height too, for a 13-year-old girl.
"After the place depressurized," Patron went on, "I think they were keen to have some more hands on deck."
"It was incredibly risky," Talon exclaimed. "How could you have been so sure Carla Orr had other operatives at the station? They could have guessed what you were up to and killed you."
"I'm sorry, ma'am," Patron replied, "but there was no way the EAC would be able to arrange a blast like that without the place being riddled with Crusaders. They would have had to get the explosives from the mining company, smuggle them into VM Major, plant them ahead of Arthur and Dwyer Orr's visit, arrange it so the security sweep overlooked them. Lots of steps. There had to be more of her followers around than only the ones who took part in the kidnapping. I did take a risk, but it was a small one."
He added,
"Once we were inside, it wasn't hard to get close to Arthur, and he recognized us immediately." "How could I not?" the injured king commented. "Then, between the two of us, we easily overpowered his guards."
"I helped too," Kayla interjected. Talon gave a loud sigh and shook her head again. "You were lucky more Crusaders didn't turn up." No chance of that, Krakoa said. The station director put the whole place in lockdown as soon as the explosion went off. It still is, while he tries to figure out who is and isn't in the EAC. White was glad to be out of that mess, but he was worried. What if Crusaders had infiltrated the security screenings to join the Defiant? In a few days, she would be leaving the solar system and heading into deep space, far from Alliance help if something were to go wrong. There would be no backup, no reinforcements. If Orr attempted to take over the ship, they might not be able to stop her. Chapter 18. The strange man had told Setia his name was Arief, but she didn't believe him. He was a liar, like Pratam. She'd sensed it in him from the beginning, but he was useful. He'd done something to her that helped her fight Soleh, something she couldn't explain, something good. She could still feel the effects even now, days later. She felt strong, capable, unbeatable. She would stick with the one who called himself Arief, at least until a better prospect came along. Was the man he'd introduced her to a better prospect? She couldn't tell, not yet. She appraised him in the dark hut where they both awaited Arief's signal. The man was from another country and had an odd name. Elek. She rolled the syllables quietly around her mouth. He looked up. "Did you say something?" "No." Elek sat at the hut's edge, leaning his back against the wooden slats. His elbows rested on his bent knees and his forearms hung loose like an orangutan's. His body wasn't very much different from the long-limbed ape. His height was more in his spine than his legs, and his head was large, made to appear even larger by his dark curly hair and beard. She had never seen his physical type in the flesh before. He was 50% larger than the average among her countrymen. Wherever he went in her land, he would stand out. That was part of his appeal, Arief had explained. "In every place in these lands, people will follow you, Elek. You can do great good here. In time, you will do great good for all humanity." Elek's eyes had shone after Arief's speech. He must have been transported with visions of sweeping across the earth like an avenging angel, righting wrongs, bringing peace and prosperity to humankind. Which was strange, considering things were better now than they'd ever been. The menace in the West, the Earth Awareness Crusade, had been subdued years ago. New technology was improving everyone's lives at work and at home. Medical treatments were advancing at a breathtaking pace. The environment was cleaner and greener than ever. The scientists had even mentioned they expected the climate to begin cooling and stabilizing within the next 50 years to a century. She guessed Elek's experience of life must have been hard if he thought human civilization on Earth was in a bad way. His clothes certainly told that story. The condition of his shorts and shirt was only marginally better than her own attire, and that wasn't saying much. Threadbare sandals clung to his bony feet. His head rose and his eyes locked on hers. "You don't need to do this, you know." It was the first time he'd opened a conversation with her since Arief had introduced them. Their mutual acquaintance rarely left them alone together, and when he did, Elek spent most of his time brooding over nameless worries. She wasn't talkative herself, so the scarcity of their discussions was no wonder. "Do what?" she asked. "Sit here with you in this stinking hut? Follow Arief's orders? Trudge around the place attending these stupid rallies?" "You do more than attend, and you know it. It's that part I'm talking about. I am not a man of violence. I disagree with Arief's methods." "Huh." Setia stood and stretched her arms and back. "How far do you think you would get without me? Mobs are vicious. They can turn in an instant, and not everyone agrees with your ideas. If you didn't have someone by your side, meeting attacks with brutal defenses, you wouldn't be able to speak like you do. This isn't the West. Here, law and order are hazy, imprecise concepts. For you, I am the law." She added, rolling her neck, "Though I'm going to suggest to Arief he recruits some more muscle. The crowds are getting bigger, and there's only so much I can do, even armed." "Yes," said Elec, his brow wrinkling. "How is it you can do what you do? You don't look like a fighter." "I think that's the point. The bullies don't expect to meet resistance when they take a swing at you. I'm usually a surprise." "Wouldn't it make more sense to have a larger, heavier muscled bodyguard? That would dissuade most people from attacking me." "Perhaps, but—" She shrugged. She'd never figured that out herself, so she couldn't explain it. "I think Arief likes it," said Elec. "Likes what?" She strode to the wall and peeked through a gap in the slats. The crowd was growing thicker and beginning to look impatient. It would be time for Elec to speak soon. She would walk with him to the podium, stand by his side while he told the people his ideas, and stick to him like glue afterward. It was usually after the speechifying, when the rally was breaking up, that a disgruntled listener would demonstrate his disagreement with what Elec had said. "He likes it when you fight. He likes my attacker's surprise when you defend me." She turned to look at him. "You don't see his face," Elec continued. "You're too busy and distracted. But I've watched Arief while you're dealing with a problem. He smiles. He enjoys it." This was news to her. But was it so bad? Most people enjoyed seeing a good fight, especially when the person you were rooting for was winning. "That isn't all," Elec said. "Have you noticed there's something strange about him? Do you get a funny feeling when he's around?" She recalled the first time she'd met Arief, when Solé had been on a mission to evict her guts from her body. Arief had appeared from nowhere. Since then, she'd convinced herself she must have missed the doorway he'd sprung from, but in truth that was unlikely. A door would have meant the difference between life and death at the time. She wouldn't have missed it. All she could remember was the sun darkening for a moment, and then suddenly Arief was there, and she couldn't deny the creepy feeling he'd given her then. The feeling had lessened over time, but spider legs still seemed to tickle her spine whenever he was near. Elec got to his feet and walked to her side. Putting his face close to hers, he whispered, "How is it you can do what you do? How did Arief find you? Why has he put us together?" There was something in his eyes that alarmed her. Desperation? Fear? Madness? She couldn't tell. The dimness of the hut and the way his face became shadowed as he leaned close made it hard to see him clearly. Burnap's balls. Mad or not, Elec was making sense. She could only fight as well as she did because Arief had done something to her. She didn't know how or why he'd found her, nor why he'd picked her to be Elec's guardian. He drew his head away from hers. "You won't say it, but you understand me." The noise of the growing crowd penetrated the hut. A chant had started up. "Elec! Elec! Elec!" Other voices joined. "If you're right," Setia said, "if there's something fishy about Arief, why are you letting him control you, setting up meetings and events like this?" "I want to speak to people, lots of people, and in person. These days, everything goes on virtually. We're all just faces on a screen. It isn't meaningful. A face on a screen could be anyone. Their words might not be their own. You can't tell. I want to reach people, make a connection, really make them think." "And you need Arief to do that?" "Since he began working for me, my followers have increased exponentially. I don't know half of what he does, but whatever it is, it works for me better than anything I've ever done before." "So you accept help from this creep you dislike and don't trust because it benefits you?" "Not me, my cause." "But you have a problem with my presence." "I don't know why you're here," Elec said. "I can't figure you out." She wasn't sure why she was here either. Maybe it was because Arief had given her something she'd never had before, power. She'd always been the underling, the weak one. Trying to survive had meant always appeasing people stronger than you. She'd done bad things. She'd supplied drugs for users, knowing they were spending money they'd stolen from their friends and family. Some of Pratam's clients had overdosed on drugs she'd given them. Though she'd never admitted it until now, she'd hated her life. She'd hated herself. Arief hadn't only given her a way out, he'd given her strengths and abilities she couldn't have hoped to achieve otherwise. They were heady narcotics. She was in deep. She met Elek's gaze. "I'm here because I want to be, the same as you." The noise of the crowd's chanting had grown so loud it almost drowned out her words. Elek nodded, satisfied. The door of the hut opened and Arief stood silhouetted in the frame. "It's time." Elek strode to the entrance. As he walked out, he lifted his arms into the air. The crowd roared. Setia followed quietly behind. Chapter 19. Talon smoothed medicated gel over Wright's thighs. The medic had said it was okay for him to recuperate in their cabin. He should be able to get up and walk in a couple of days, she'd said, and by this time next week his legs would be back to normal. The pulse round had only seared his skin and flesh and hadn't penetrated to the bones. It was a fortunate escape. Things could have been a lot worse in so many ways. When Taylan thought back over what had happened, her gut clenched as deadly scenarios played out in her head. "Hey, it's all over now," Wright said gently, clearly seeing the tension in her face. "Everyone's okay." "Yeah, you're right." She forced her mind to turn to happier things. He would get better, and so would Arthur. Patron and Kayla had received a boost to their self-esteem and a rep among the crew, and a tight lid had been sealed on Carla Orr and her son. Perhaps no one would have to set eyes on them for the entire voyage. It would take them months to reach the area the Skein mappers had suggested. Wright and she would be able to spend plenty of time together when he wasn't on duty, as there was almost nothing else to do. Her hand moved lazily over his quads, spreading out the gel evenly. Then it began to stray. After a few moments, Wright gave a small cough. "That's, not a wound, and while I would love to..." She chuckled, wiped her hands clean on a towel, and moved up the bed before lying down next to him, resting her head on his chest. He wrapped an arm around her. His chest hair tickled her nose. "You know, you never told me your real name." "You can call me what you like. Nitwit, whatever, I don't mind." "That's not the point. You never told me what TJ stands for." He was silent. "Maybe I can guess," she said. "Is it Tyler Jacob? Trevor Jeremiah?" "No, it's too hard to figure out both names at the same time. I'll just try to guess your first name. Is it Thomas? Theo? Toby?" She could hear his heartbeat quickening. She sat up. "It's one of those two, isn't it? Theo or Toby? Which one is it?" "Talon. Leave it. It isn't important." He looked uncomfortable, and she couldn't understand why. "It's only a name. If it's embarrassing, it doesn't matter. I swear I won't tell anyone. But it's weird that we're married and I don't know your name." He'd behaved oddly at their wedding, handing over the marriage document to the registrar after completing his part without allowing her to see it. "If I really wanted to know, I only need to look up our marriage certificate. You might as well tell me." "Then look it up," he said gruffly, turning away. She had a sudden feeling she'd stumbled into unknown, unanticipated territory. I won't if you don't want me to. Sorry I brought it up." She lay her head on his chest once more, but he didn't put his arm over her shoulders. The mood had shifted, turning fraught and pained. She'd said something wrong, delved where she shouldn't have, and she didn't know how to get back to normality. Wright murmured something too quietly for her to make out. "What did you say?"
"Timbo Janus."
"What? Timbo Janus?"
"Don't make me repeat it a third time."
"What the hell kind of name is that? You're kidding, right?" His heart thudded centimeters below her ear.
"Do I sound like I'm kidding?"
"Are they family names?"
"Not that I'm aware of."
"Then why?" Wright had told her his parents were dead. Aside from the mention of the alien masquerading as his father, he'd never mentioned them again. She knew absolutely nothing about them, except perhaps now she understood they were utter nutcases.
"I think it was a joke,"
he said quietly. "Why would your parents pick a joke name for their baby?"
"I think they didn't really want a child, and they wanted to punish me for my existence."
"But then why did they have you?"
"I don't know. Perhaps I was a mistake they didn't find out about until it was too late to do anything. Or maybe when the reality of parenthood hit them, they changed their minds. It was all a long time ago. I don't like to talk about it."
"Bringing up kids is hard," she said, "even when they're wanted and planned. I can understand when parents don't do a great job, but to give your baby a ridiculous name as a joke is incredibly cruel." She lifted herself up to look him in the eyes. He wore an expression she'd never seen on him before, like a small boy's, sad and alone. Sliding her hands under his shoulders, she hugged him tightly.
"Ow," he said. "You're..."
"Sorry." She shifted away from his wounded legs. "Hey, you don't think Colburn's like a...
"What?"
"I don't want to say it."
"Come on, you can't leave me hanging. Colburn's like a what?"
A mother figure to you?" Laughter exploded from Wright, immediately followed by groans of pain. "Sorry," she said, trying to control her own giggles.
"Shit, Talon, don't do that to me."
Gradually their mirth subsided, and they lay still, not speaking. Soon the Defiant would start up her FTL engine and begin her journey, slipping along invisible pathways through the galaxy, flying at unimaginable speeds aided by her part-organic hull. Who knew what lay ahead? But for now, for Talon, she was grateful for the small respite. She was with Wright, they were together, and together they would face whatever trials the future held. Chapter 20. Talon feinted to the left. Arthur moved his shield to block the blow. At the last moment, she diverted her sword's path to the right, bypassing his defense. Arthur leapt backwards, arching his torso away from the blade's point. Talon pushed her advantage, swinging quickly out, then in again, aiming for his unprotected side. Once more her sword met empty air, but it was a hair's breadth from touching him. Another step forward and another swipe, downward this time. The point thudded into Arthur's shield. Twisting it free, she raised the blade faster than Arthur could follow. The sword neared his throat. He turned fast, too fast, and stumbled, falling to the deck, his shield flailing outward. She pinned the arm holding it under one foot, angled her blade perpendicular to Arthur's face, and drove it downward. The tip hovered above his eyes.
"Ha!"
Arthur exclaimed.
"You killed me again. How many times is it now? Hundreds or maybe thousands?"
"You're thinking of Lancelot," she replied, helping him to his feet. "I've only killed you 20 or 30 times.
"You're right. I was forgetting. Your styles are so similar, it's easy to get you two confused."
"If you know my style so well, how come you can't beat me?"
"You're too fast, and part of your style is not to be repetitive or predictable. That's hard to beat."
"If you were wielding Excalibur, I'd be dead."
"Perhaps."
Arthur's sword had been a mystical gift that supposedly prevented him from receiving any mortal wounds. They were practicing with blunt weapons. Arthur refused to ever fight her with Excalibur, even in full protective gear, saying he didn't want to hurt her by mistake. Since Merlin had reunited him with his sword, he'd kept it with him always, up until his inspection tour of Valus Marineris Major, when he'd been persuaded to leave it behind. Was that why he'd been vulnerable to pulse fire and Mars's atmosphere? No one knew. Arthur's answer to the conundrum was to refuse to be parted from his weapon again. Even now the famous blade stood propped up in a corner of the gym, where Wright now also stood, leaning a shoulder on the bulkhead, smiling as she noticed him. "How long have you been watching us?" she asked.
"Not long. Witnessing another of my defeats?" asked Arthur cheerfully, clapping Wright on the shoulder as he left to change out of his gear. "Only as a secondary effect," Wright replied. "I'm here to see Talon."
She'd also walked across to him during the brief exchange, removing her sparring helmet. Now she'd reached him, she wrapped him in her arms and kissed him. Breaking for air, he said,
"I'm not sure I'm supposed to do this on duty. In fact, I'm sure I'm not."
"I don't care."
"To be honest, I care less and less these days too. We just need to get this job done."
"I know."
"If you've finished, do you want to come with me to the habitat?"
"Sure, give me 10 minutes." She quickly showered and dressed. Arthur accompanied them along the Defiant to the end section, which had been devoted to Iolani's green space, the zone intended to help maintain the mission members' mental health. Talon liked the habitat, but she hadn't been here often. Spending time with Wright and her kids brought her all the happiness she needed, for the time being anyway. She hadn't felt a need to walk the metal grid paths among lush foliage or feel the warm, moist air on her skin. They found Iolani near the center on her knees in fresh soil, pressing a plant into place. "Guys," she said, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her knees. "You've come to see me? That's sweet."
"It's a semi-official visit," Wright replied. "I thought it would be fun to bring Talon and Arthur along. How are things going around here?"
"In what sense?" she asked, somewhat warily.
"In whatever sense you think is important. Is there anything I should know?"
"Well, let's take a walk." She led them down one of the choice of paths, apparently randomly. Tropical trees rose overhead, their branches thick with hanging vines. Exotic flowers sprouted from nooks and crevices in their bark, and ferny undergrowth covered the ground, spilling out onto the path. They walked over rivulets and pools sparkling through the mesh holes. Talon thought she saw the flash of silvery scales and the slither of a reptilian back. "Are there animals here too?" she asked. "Absolutely," replied Iolani. "Microorganisms inhabit all living things, but the habitat is also home to many kinds of invertebrates and vertebrates, including apex predators. Not," she added with a laugh, "anything that could hurt humans. It's a self-sustaining, self-perpetuating system, as close as I could make it. Striking the right balance is incredibly complicated. I have to check population numbers daily, but that isn't too hard with the sensors. It's all worked pretty well so far. I hope things continue the same for the whole voyage."
"So does Admiral Yorkson," said Wright. "That's why he's asked me to report on how things are going."
Iolani hummed meditatively, but continued to appear reluctant to speak her mind. Talon said, "I think I like the light best." The lamps overhead shone brightly, casting sharp-edged shadows. The effect was as close to sunlight as she'd ever known from an artificial source. You couldn't look straight at it. Perhaps it was something to do with the new tech.
"The light is wonderful,"
Arthur agreed.
"I almost feel as though I were back on Earth, but not in my home country. These plants and this heat and moisture are strange to me."
Iolani smiled. "I'm sorry I couldn't create something more familiar for you. I had many climate types to choose from. In the end, I indulged myself and settled for the environment I grew used to in my years in Suriname." "It's so beautiful here," said Talon. "It must have been a wrench to leave home and go work on a sterile starship. How did Lorcan persuade you to join the Antarctic project? Was the salary too hard to resist? Iolani burst into laughter. Talon had a feeling she had done a Kayla. Sorry, did I say something wrong? No, it's a fair question. Let's just say Lorcan can be remarkably persuasive when he puts his mind to it. Oh, I can believe that. Here we are, said Iolani, halting. They'd reached a junction of walkways. A path crossed theirs, and they had a choice of going left or right. But Iolani turned to face them and rested her back on the guardrail in front of a multi-shaded green background. You know what I love best about the place? Not waiting for a reply, she answered her own question. The night sky. She must have been carrying some kind of controller, because the lights rapidly dimmed until the place was utterly dark. It was then Talon saw the stars. Is that real? Beyond the tree canopy hung the harsh blackness of space and the starscape. Talon had expected the configurations to be unfamiliar. The Defiant was already far from the solar system. What she hadn't been expecting was to see them moving. The pinpricks of light really were subtly swimming, circling, and performing other movements stars were not supposed to perform. It's real, Iolani confirmed. The chief engineer, what's her name? Kroll, Wright supplied. That's it. She explained it's an effect of our passage through the Skein. Nothing to be alarmed about. In fact, if you watch it for a while, it's quite restful. The four stood in silence, contemplating the strange view. The plants need a period of darkness to grow properly, said Iolani. I could have just programmed regular hours for turning off the lights, but I thought a night sky might help people's mental health just as much as a green environment. I asked if it was possible, and surprisingly, it was. Hey, she added, apparently as an afterthought, would you like to see, or rather feel, something else cool? I would, Talon replied. Step this way. The stars shone sufficiently brightly to see her slip under the guardrail. Talon did the same. Don't worry too much about treading on something, said Iolani. It'll regrow. She pushed through the leaves and Talon caught them as they sprang back. They walked several meters over the spongy ground before she understood where Iolani was taking her. Are we heading for the hull? Exactly. But have you ever felt it? Talon had not. This is the only place on the ship where you can actually touch it. Iolani had slowed down. Talon could just make out her reaching forward in the darkness. She made a soft sound of satisfaction and said, Give me your hand. Gently holding on to Talon's wrist, she pulled her forward and placed her palm against something warm and moist. At first, Talon thought Iolani had made a mistake and she was touching a peculiarly warm tree trunk. But then she sensed a flow beneath her fingertips. It was as if she had her hand on the thin, flexible skin of a warm water pipe. That's it, she whispered. That's the Defiant's hull? She felt more than saw Iolani's nod. Whoa, I know, right? It's alive. When they returned to the walkway, Wright and Arthur were in muted conversation. Find something interesting? Wright asked as Talon climbed onto the metal gridwork. You could say that. You should let Iolani show you. Another time, maybe. Iolani, what should I tell Yorkson? Everything looks good to me, but I'm not the expert here. As far as I can tell, you've done a terrific job, and I'm happy to report that. I appreciate the compliment, said Iolani, but I'm fast coming to the conclusion this place is a complete disaster. She turned on the lights. The effect was like a swift, bright sunrise. Wright's eyebrows popped up. But it's wonderful, said Talon. I wish I'd come here more often and brought the kids. That's the point, Iolani said. Look around you. While you've been here, have you seen one other person? Arthur replied, I've seen no one else. Iolani frowned. People come here, walk around, love it to bits, and don't come back. I'm not sure why. That's something for the psychologists to work out. But I'm worried the habitat is having the exact opposite effect from its intention. Maybe it's too beautiful, too reminiscent of Earth. What if it's making the visitors more homesick than they are already? Wright groaned. I see what you mean. When we were on the Dauntless, Iolani went on, I missed green spaces so much it hurt. I really thought this place was the solution to the problems we had on that trip. Now I think I might have been completely wrong. Is it really that important? Taylan asked. Humans have been travelling in space for centuries. We're used to it. What's the worst that can happen? A look passed between Iolani and Wright she couldn't fathom. The end. This has been The Defiant, Star Legend Book 6, and the final book in the Star Legend series, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Follow Caris and Setia's story in the spin-off series and space colonization adventure Interstellar Fleet, Book 1, Talman Prime. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.